I knew the night was off to a strange start the minute I checked in. The ranger station, which normally felt like a second home to me, seemed smaller and lonelier than usual. Even the warm glow from the overhead lights couldn't chase away the gloom pouring in from the windows. I stepped inside, figuring I'd see Pat, Marcus, and Dana gathered around the battered table in the corner, trading jokes while we waited out another quiet shift. Instead, I found them pacing around, each one fiddling with equipment or rechecking logs. It was my turn to do a final walkthrough outside. Usually, I enjoyed strolling around under the moonlight, scoping out the tree line for raccoons or wandering deer. Tonight, the moon was hidden behind roiling clouds, and the path beyond the station was pitch black. The wind whipped across the roof, making the beams groan. I half wondered if the entire structure would shake itself apart. After a few minutes of testing the locks and listening for anything unusual, I stepped back inside, my jacket dripping with cold dew. Pat gave me this look that said, "All good out there?" I nodded, but I didn't really feel certain. Before I could settle at the desk, Dana spoke up. She's usually the practical one, never letting gossip or superstitions rattle her. But her expression was guarded. She asked if we'd ever heard rumors about the Phantom of Hollow Grove. Marcus let out a nervous laugh, but Pat's face turned serious. Dana explained how this old local legend had been passed around since before any of us were hired, a name tied to unexplained vanishings, especially when the moon was at its fullest. She didn't sound like she was spinning a campfire story. Her voice was calm, too calm, like she was remembering something unsettling. The station lights flickered just then. It might have been a hiccup in the power, but it made every single nerve in me go on alert. Even the fireplace, which usually made the room cozy, seemed to cast weird shadows across the walls. Pat ventured to the window and peered out. The glass was flecked with condensation, making it tough to see anything but vague outlines of trees shifting in the wind. Marcus, normally the easygoing one, was already double-checking the radio as if he expected to need backup at any second. I felt this nagging urge to go outside again, to scan the perimeter and be absolutely sure we were alone. Yet, the idea of venturing past the door gave me pause. I remembered all the times I'd teased guests about being nervous in the dark, and suddenly I wondered if I'd been a fool to brush off what the woods might conceal. Something about the night put a knot in my chest. I kept seeing movement in the corners of my eyes, just enough to unsettle me. Every time I turned, there was nothing but old walls and dusty corners. Dana cleared her throat and said we should try to keep it together, that sometimes these shifts set our imaginations on overdrive. She kept talking about how the stories of Hollow Grove weren't just for spooking tourists. There was a grain of truth buried in them, enough to make even skeptics look over their shoulders now and then. I wanted to brush it off, but I couldn't. Not with the wind howling outside like it had a purpose. Not with the odd quiet in the station, even though the four of us were there. And definitely not with the sense that something or someone was beyond our beam of light, standing just out of sight, waiting. We didn't speak for a while after that. We just sat there, each lost in our own thoughts, half expecting a knock on the door or a flicker of movement in the dark. When we finally did say anything, it was barely above a whisper, as if we were afraid of who else might be listening. Dana had a faraway look that practically begged us to lean in. I could see she wasn't sure if she really wanted to rehash whatever was sitting on her mind, but she let out a shaky sigh and began. "A couple years back," she said quietly, "I was finishing up a shift here. The weather had been horrible for days. Relentless rain, all the trails basically sludge. Nobody was bothering to visit, which meant I had to keep an eye out by myself. That night, I was still new enough to think every single bump outside could be a stray animal. Except, the sounds I heard weren't from an animal." She paused, gazing at the table. None of us moved. Even Pat, who usually tries to crack a joke and break tension, just watched her in silence. Dana went on about how she'd spent the whole evening hauling fallen branches off the paths. When the sun set, she ducked inside, thinking she'd wait out the storm and call it a night. The wind was raging so hard the station windows rattled every few seconds. Finally, her stomach growled, so she ordered from the nearest diner. Old Henry, a delivery guy everyone in town knew, pulled up half an hour later. She stepped out onto the porch to grab her food. "I remember how dark it felt," she said, rubbing her hands together like she could still feel the chill. There was this dampness that wouldn't let go. The diner headlights cut across the station's walls, but everything else was swallowed by black sky. She tried to keep it casual, chatting with Henry about the rain, about how he managed to drive in such miserable conditions. But he kept glancing over her shoulder. Finally, he blurted out that somebody was standing among the twisted oaks near the fence. Dana saw nothing at first, just the silhouette of trees shifting in the wind. Then she made out a shape, thin, ragged, like it was half crouched behind a trunk. That's when they both heard it, something like a hushed voice telling them to go. "It didn't feel like a threat," Dana admitted, tapping her fingers on the table. "It was more like someone warning us." But I couldn't begin to guess who or what was trying to help. The fear ramped up quick. She and Henry jumped into his car without saying a word, not caring about anything but getting down that mud-slick road. The tires spun, kicking up gravel and water, and they raced off. A couple miles later, Henry pulled over, and they just sat there, shaking from adrenaline. Neither one could fully believe what they'd seen. Dana spent the next minutes debating how to explain taking off mid-shift, but it turned out she didn't have to. By that time, she said, the station security system had already caught a group dressed in dark, hooded coats, smashing the door in. They roamed inside for about 5 minutes, rummaging around with this eerie calm. They didn't steal a thing. It was more like they were inspecting the place, searching for something. Then, they walked out into the storm like none of it mattered, leaving behind a few soaked footprints and a lot of unanswered questions. "The cops called me in," Dana said, lowering her voice, "and all they could figure was a botched robbery. But who breaks down a door just to poke around? They never left a single fingerprint." We all glanced around, half expecting to see those hooded figures lurking right outside our windows. Dana's story was unnerving enough, but she wasn't done. She mentioned the little wooden bundle she discovered later, lying in the corner near the supply closet. A pile of twigs bound with a strip of ribbon so tightly knotted that she had to use a knife to cut it. No one in the department could explain it, and eventually, someone just tossed it in a box to be forgotten. "That was the same day the break-in happened," she said. "So call me paranoid if you want. But I've spent every day since wondering why those people came in and who they really were. Maybe it has something to do with all the old stories about this place, or maybe we just got unlucky. But either way, I still can't shake the feeling it's not over." She finished talking, and the low hum of our electrical devices was the only noise left. I was imagining Henry's headlights reflecting on a figure half hidden by trunk and branch, waving them away like it was granting mercy. Dana blinked a few times as if waking from a bad dream, and that's when I realized her story had changed the air in the room. We weren't just rangers killing time on another routine shift. We were 4 uneasy souls perched in a remote station with something out there in the darkness, a presence that might help us or harm us, and we had no way of knowing which. We all fell silent after Dana finished her story, like we were waiting for the shadows outside to respond. Pat broke the tension first, clearing his throat and suggesting a perimeter check. It should have been routine, but every step felt heavy. I volunteered to team up with Dana while Pat and Marcus swept the back. Outside, the air was colder than before. The station's floodlight didn't reach far, so most of the yard was barely visible. I noticed how the wind had died down. It made every noise echo like the forest was an empty stage waiting for an actor to appear. Dana and I started circling around the side, flashlights bouncing off twisted branches and soggy undergrowth. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself we were just being thorough. Yet it felt like we were trespassing on something's territory. A few yards from the storage shed, our beams picked up footprints, barefoot, pressed into the mud. They veered in a weird, meandering path toward the tree line. I glanced at Dana, who knelt and prodded one of the prints with her finger. They were fresh enough to still glisten with moisture. Goosebumps prickled along my arms. Nobody sane would walk around barefoot at this hour. Suddenly, a branch snapped in the distance, louder than it should have been. My flashlight swung toward the tree line, finding nothing but dark shapes. Then I spotted a tiny wooden figure perched on a fallen log, a crude stick person tied with a thread the color of dried blood. For a moment, I could have sworn it tilted its head at me. I knew that was impossible, but it felt real. Dana approached slowly, her steps careful. She reached out and lifted the figure up close. It was damp and smelled faintly of rotting leaves, some kind of totem or warning. We heard murmurs then, hushed voices carrying through the quiet of the night. I flicked off my flashlight, signaling Dana to do the same. Through the gloom, we made out movement. Silhouettes shifting among the trees, maybe 4 or 5. They moved in a rhythmic way, as if following a practiced formation. No flashlights, no phones, just bodies and shadows. We crouched, our hearts pounding, thoughts racing about what we'd do if they headed our way. Pat and Marcus stumbled upon us, nearly causing me to jump. Marcus mouthed, "We saw them too," pointing toward another patch of darkness. We decided in silent agreement to back up to the station. As we retreated, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced we were being watched. But I caught only faint outlines flickering through the trees. Inside, we locked the doors, drew the blinds, and shoved a heavy table against the main entrance. The logs in the fireplace popped, scattering embers in a sudden burst. Usually that sound is comforting, but this time it felt more like a warning shot. No one sat. We hovered near the windows, peeking out through narrow gaps in the blinds. The station smelled of damp clothes and fear, if fear can have a smell. Pat wanted to call for backup, but Dana hesitated. What if they're gone by the time anyone arrives? We'll look paranoid. She had a point. I remembered the story she told us, the unanswered questions left behind after the hooded group trashed the station. If they were the same ones prowling outside, they'd likely vanish as soon as they heard sirens. Time dragged. The wind picked up again, rattling the siding. My eyes burned from staring out the window, half expecting to see faces pressed against the glass. The phone lines were spotty this far out. If the lines went down, we'd be stranded without any communication. Marcus joked about how we should have transferred to a beach post, but the humor fell flat. We all knew we were in over our heads. Hours later, the forest remained silent, like it was holding its breath for something worse. We agreed to wait for first light before making any bold moves. Whatever lurked outside, it felt like it was waiting too. The 4 of us ended up around the fireplace, jumpy at every twig snap or gust of wind. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew the night wasn't done testing us. As the clock inched closer to dawn, we heard the faintest scrape against the back wall, like someone running a blade or a rock along the wood. I stood, flashlight trembling in my hand. But the noise stopped. No footsteps, no break-in. Just a reminder. They were still out there. We realized morning might not bring any safety at all. But for now, it was the only hope we had. We took turns peering through the windows, watching for shapes among the trees, each minute feeling like an hour. There was a shared, unspoken sense that whatever happened tonight was just the prelude. And as we huddled by the sputtering fire, none of us felt particularly eager to see what came next. I made my decision before sunrise. We all did. By the time the gray light started filtering through the station's grim, smeared windows, our nerves were shredded. Every noise from the night before still seemed to echo in the back of my mind. The shifting silhouettes, those footprints in the mud, that faint scrape against the wall. None of us had slept. We were running on pure adrenaline and dread. Pat asked if anyone wanted breakfast, trying to mask the tension with a sliver of normalcy. But no one had much appetite. Marcus simply shook his head, staring at the barrier we'd set against the door. Dana, who had always been our rock, looked like a stranger. Her eyes were dark, hollow circles. She forced a small smile, but didn't say anything. I realized we'd each reached the end of our tether, We peeled back the blinds to watch the first rays of morning cut through the forest, turning the nearest treetops into dull silhouettes. Though the night had receded, it hadn't taken that malevolent feeling with it. I still sensed we were being watched. Maybe from the shadows. Maybe from beyond the battered fence line. That unshakable dread was enough to convince me I couldn't keep doing this. Marcus packed his gear in a frantic, clumsy way, almost as if he thought we needed to evacuate immediately. I couldn't blame him. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing it with whatever personal items I could find. Spare clothes, an old mug, a few dog-eared field guides. None of us spoke more than a few words, but there was a shared understanding. We were done. For good. It was like the forest itself had finally broken our last bit of resolve. Pat tore down the makeshift barricade, tossing the table aside with a grunt. "I'm not sticking around," he mumbled, blinking away the fatigue that clung to all of us. "I'll do the paperwork, whatever it takes, but I'm not coming back here." Dana stayed silent, but her eyes darted around the station one final time, almost as if she was memorizing every crack and splinter. I could only imagine what she was feeling, given her past run-ins with whatever lurked out there. Then she swallowed hard and whispered, "Let's go." We stepped outside, the morning air chilling our lungs. Instead of the usual dawn chorus of birds, there was near complete silence. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting to see if we'd actually leave. A low haze lingered around the tree roots, and the wind hissed through damp leaves. That creeping unease wouldn't let up. I felt like eyes were drilling holes in the back of my head. At the trucks, we didn't even try to pretend we'd come back. Normally, there'd be talk of the next shift or a reminder to lock up carefully. This time, we just piled in, turned the keys, and drove away. No glances in the rearview mirror. We knew what we were leaving behind. It wasn't just the station. It was the memory of that horrific night. The footprints in the mud, the indecipherable murmurs among the trees, and the strange totems that hinted we were in over our heads. As we hit the main road, I felt a glimmer of relief mixed with guilt. Part of me worried about the next person who'd fill our roles, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The forest had become too loaded with shadows and unanswered questions. We pulled up to the Central Ranger office later that morning. The woman at the front desk looked startled as we handed over our resignations in near unison. Pat's words tumbled out, shaky but resolute. "We're done. No more nights out there. No more of whatever's in those woods." Nobody asked a single follow-up question. Maybe they'd heard rumors. Maybe they saw our pale faces and realized we'd seen enough. All I know is we gathered our belongings from our lockers without a glance back. I heard Dana quietly mutter that if anyone tried to make her go back, she'd drive 3 states away before she set foot in another forest. Marcus just nodded and patted her shoulder. We left that day, each in our own car, driving away from the ranger service and the job we'd once loved. Even though I was relieved, there was a tiny voice in my head warning me. Those woods wouldn't forget us. Sometimes, when I'm alone and thinking too much, I picture the bare footprints and those hooded shapes slipping back beneath the branches. There's a sense of finality to it, but also a lingering question mark. Did we escape or just postpone the inevitable? Either way, I've got no intention of going back to find out. And if anyone were to ask, I'd tell them the same thing. Some places aren't meant to be understood or conquered. Some forests can keep their secrets. And I'll keep my distance forever. Between February of 1983 and November of 1985, I was employed by the United States Forest Service. Back then, the Forest Service ran a kind of earn-as-you-learn program, where you could spend a couple of years as a paid intern, learn the ropes, and then graduate as a fully fledged forest ranger, if you proved yourself capable. I signed up, was selected for induction, and then was sent up to the Woot National Forest as a trainee ranger. I spent the next 6 months realizing I was just about born for that kind of work. I'm not saying it couldn't be hard. It was exhausting at times. But the sense of duty, the feeling that you were doing something good and honorable, was more valuable to me than any paycheck. Those first 6 months were some of the happiest of my life, and at the time, I could see myself walking trails and working on restoration projects for the rest of my career. But then, toward the end of '83, I was offered a very different kind of assignment. Having proven myself capable of working unsupervised and having already confessed to enjoying all the solitude the job had to offer, my district ranger, basically the area chief, asked if I wanted to spend the summer of '84 working as a seasonal fire lookout over on Waldo Mountain. Waldo Mountain is around 50 miles east of Eugene, Oregon, and it overlooks Waldo Lake as well as the Waldo Wilderness area to its north. The lookout is no longer functioning as such today and operates as a kind of public shelter on a first-come, first-served basis. But back then, it was a fully stocked, live-in fire lookout that was occupied by either a forest ranger or a trained volunteer all summer long. The usual arrangement was that 3 different rangers would each do a month-long stretch up at the lookout. But when it came to delegating fire lookout duties for the following summer, staffing problems meant that there were only me and 1 other member of the park staff available for the job. If I did a 6-week-long stretch up in the lookout from early June until mid-July, my district ranger would make sure it reflected very favorably on me when it came to offering me a full-time position. And so, about 6 months after the offer, I was headed out to Waldo Mountain with my first 2 weeks' worth of supplies. Now, a lot of you might be picturing the Waldo Mountain lookout as being your typical sort of tower and cabin structure. And that's exactly what I was picturing too, before I actually saw the thing. But when I got there, I found it was basically just a small cabin built atop a rocky outcrop. As you can imagine, being so high up on top of a mountain, the views from inside the lookout were nothing short of spectacular. But boy, was it cramped in there. It was maybe 12 by 12 feet, with a cooking and sleeping area crammed into one corner, a small map table in the center, and some cabinets and the ham radio tucked into another. That was to be my home for the next 6 weeks, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't find the prospect just a little daunting once I was actually faced with it. I thought being alone up there would be easy. The only thing I didn't really consider was the sense of boredom that would set in once my regular duties were out of the way. Being a fire lookout isn't just sitting around waiting for a fire. Since weather conditions hugely influence wildfire behavior, lookouts monitor things like temperature, humidity, and wind speed in order to assess danger levels and potentially even predict a fire's source and behavior based on those observations. This can actually take up a surprising amount of time. Outside of that, lookouts are entirely responsible for maintaining and repairing their shelter and equipment, which, again, can swallow up a surprising amount of time once you realize the summer rains can make your lookout leak like a sieve. But once all those observation and maintenance tasks were over and done with, life up on Waldo Mountain was actually kind of boring. I started out by hiking up and down the ridge to get a really good look at the area. Sometimes I'd head down to one of the lakes nearby to take a bath. I also planned to make the 2 books I brought with me last the whole 6 weeks. But I finished The Sicilian by Mario Puzo in about a week and discovered I could only read The Hunt for Red October for about an hour at a time before all the technical stuff made my head hurt. So then, one day, with nothing else to do but twiddle my thumbs, I decided to familiarize myself with the ham radio. I'd been left instructions on how to use it, as well as what frequencies to dial into if I ever needed to get in touch with anyone. But I figured that instead of trying to learn on the fly while panicking after spotting a forest fire, I should probably mess around with it a little, if only to test if it was properly functioning. I'd been told that I needed to do weekly radio tests anyway, but all that involved was squeezing the little receiver, saying, radio check, over, and then waiting for a response. But then, I wanted to see if the rumors were true, that on a good day, I'd be able to use that little old ham radio to talk to folks as far away as Hawaii. So, like I said, one day I just sat down at the little desk it was mounted on and decided to start playing around with it. You have to remember, this was way before cell phones were as common as they are today. Back in the early 80s, things like ham radios were a much more popular form of long-range communication, especially among a small band of dedicated hobbyists. That being the case, I figured there was a pretty good chance of me finding a voice among the static. I didn't even really plan on talking at first. I was simply content to find an active frequency and listen in on whatever was being said. But then, since I didn't hear anything, I decided to start talking. I remember cycling through the frequencies, listening first, and then repeating something along the lines of, "This is Waldo Mountain Fire Lookout calling. Do you read me? Over." I'd talk, wait about 10 to 15 seconds for a response, then, when I didn't get one, move on to the next. I did this maybe 20 or 30 times, just out of pure boredom, really. When, on one particular frequency around the 14 megahertz high frequency mark, I suddenly heard a man's voice come back at me through the buzz of white noise. "Waldo Mountain, this is Pelican Butte Fire Lookout," I heard the voice say. "Receiving you loud and clear. How copy? Over." I didn't really know how to talk over radio. I was just told to say over when I was done speaking, and over and out when I was finished talking altogether. So in reply, I just tried to wing it as best I could. "Copy loud and clear, Pelican Butte. Good to hear you." Then I asked exactly where they were located. The guy said he was down near Klamath, almost 80 miles south, and not too far from Mount McLaughlin and the California state line. I guess that's not all that far for a ham radio on a good day. But I was still impressed at how clear it sounded, despite the guy being almost 100 miles away. I was also rather pleased to have someone to talk to. I know I talked about how content I was with my own company, but after going 2 weeks with only one solitary face-to-face encounter with another human being, I was surprised at how much I appreciated hearing another person's voice. The guy said his name was Jim, and that he was a forest ranger with the team down in... It was his 5th season in a row acting as a live-in fire lookout. He sounded very experienced and gave me lots of advice, the most appreciated being his tips on how to keep cabin fever at bay. For those unfamiliar with the term, cabin fever is when people start to feel restless or irritable because they've been indoors or in the same place for too long. Some folks say it can drive you crazy, and although there's no real danger of that up in a fire lookout, that sense of being trapped with your own thoughts can wear on even the strongest of people. I jokingly asked Jim if he ever knew any lookouts who went crazy, either from the isolation or just being stuck in one place for all that time. He reassured me by saying no, he'd never known anyone to lose their mind or anything. He'd known plenty who quit, especially the civilian volunteers that were drafted whenever staffing levels weren't ideal, but he'd never known anyone to go crazy. Then Jim did mention how he thought I was very brave for taking the Waldo Mountain Lookout this season, especially in light of what happened to the last volunteer. Obviously, those are just about the most ominous words a person in my position could ever wish to hear, so right away I asked Jim what he was talking about. He gave me this almost theatrical kind of, "Oh, you didn't know?" and then started saying how he didn't think he should be the one to tell me. But luckily, it only took a little polite cajoling to get him to spill the story. As a matter of fact, I never actually asked what happened to the previous year's lookout. I just took it for granted that a ranger or volunteer had completed the season without any sort of incident. It didn't even occur to me to ask about previous lookouts or their experiences. I just blindly accepted the position, thinking it'd be a paid camping vacation. There was obviously the slight danger of animal attacks if you strayed too far from the lookout, and I had heard rumors of a tower up in Washington getting struck by lightning. But aside from that, what else was there to go wrong up here? Well, Jim was nice enough to fill me in. The last Waldo Mountain Fire Lookout, who had volunteered the previous year, had vanished during the final few weeks of their assignment. One day, A ranger went up to the lookout with some pallets of canned food and water, only to find the place completely deserted. They looked around a little, thinking the volunteer lookout was off taking a wash or something of that nature, and then decided to wait for them. An hour or so passed, so instead of waiting any further, the ranger headed back to HQ and figured they'd check in via radio to make sure the volunteer was doing okay. 24 hours passed, and no one had heard a single thing from the volunteer lookout. So another ranger headed up Waldo Mountain to check on them, only to find the place still deserted. The ranger team figured the volunteer had simply had enough and called it quits. But if that was the case, why was all their stuff still up in the lookout? All their clothes and their food were still there. Hell, even their boots were just lying inside the door, meaning that wherever they went, they did so in bare feet, or maybe sandals. Jim said he and the team down in Clamo followed the volunteer's disappearance as best they could. Losing a lookout like that felt personal, and Jim said the Clamo team even sent a few rangers up to Wamut to help with the search and rescue effort. But the volunteer was never found, and as far as Jim knew, they were still officially a missing person. I asked him what he thought had happened to the missing volunteer, and he said it was difficult to say. It wasn't out of the question that they'd taken a nasty fall someplace, maybe even down a ravine or into a hidden cave system, which might explain why they were never found. But then again, Jim said that you also couldn't rule out some kind of foul play. Maybe it was a personal thing. The volunteer had an enemy, someone they'd made very angry, who was devious enough to realize that hitting them someplace secluded like that might make for the perfect murder. Or maybe, just maybe, this poor soul got themselves selected almost at random by a killer who saw an opportunity and just took it. I remember listening to all of that and feeling the hairs on my arms and neck stand on end. Jim said he didn't mean to scare me and offered up a final theory involving the volunteer just voluntarily leaving, having gotten sick and tired of the lookout lifestyle to the point that they couldn't even bring themselves to carry their stuff home. You did indeed get the occasional rich kid heading up there to find themselves or something for those 3 months, only to realize they were wasting their entire summer vacation by week 2 or 3. So, if he had to put his money where his mouth was, Jim said he'd have gone with that. Granted, that final theory was probably the most likely outcome. But I'm also not scared to admit that the stuff he'd said first had me pretty shaken up. I kept a .38 with me just in case I ran into an overly friendly mountain lion, and that would obviously work at keeping a person at bay too. But the idea of someone creeping up on the lookout in the middle of the night while I was fast asleep, that was most definitely enough to give me the heebie-jeebies. I thanked Jim for passing on the info. Then, at the next available opportunity, I asked one of the WT Rangers about the missing volunteer from the previous year. They said they had no idea what I was talking about, that the ranger who had served as lookout the previous summer was one of the same ones who couldn't do it this year. I'd actually worked with this ranger on several different occasions, so I knew from personal experience that they hadn't gone missing, or that if they had, they sure had turned up again. I mentioned this to Jim the next time I got in touch with him, and he basically gave it the old, "Oh, that's what they told you, is it?" And I suppose they had folks just jumping at the chance to serve as lookouts this year, huh? Hearing him say that prompted a moment of terrified realization, so much so that I literally felt the color draining from my face as I listened. It was possible that Jim knew the WT Ranger had trouble finding lookouts for that season, so much so that I'd been asked to complete an extended stay. But even if he didn't know and it was just pure guesswork on his part, he was right. Once again, I got in touch with WUTHQ using my ham radio and asked them if the whole missing volunteer thing was true. My district ranger denied the whole thing and told me that I must have been getting some bad info from someplace. He said that he'd never heard of any Jim down there and that he'd be in touch with Clamo's district ranger all the same. He claimed that it wasn't very professional for one of the rangers to be spreading rumors like that, and that I was to disregard anything I'd been told. Now, I know I should have just listened to my superiors at WUT, but you also need to appreciate the unusual position I was in back then. There just wasn't any Google or smartphones to fact-check things at the drop of a hat. All I had with me was my radio, and I couldn't simply abandon my post to go off investigating all the stuff I'd been told. The only thing I really had to go on was this. Unlike other years when the Rangers were inundated with hundreds of volunteer lookout applications, it had been almost impossible to properly staff the lookout for the '85 season. That's the thing that played on my mind until, in the end, I had no idea who to believe. As crazy as this might sound, I chose not to confront Jim regarding what he told me about the missing volunteer. In my head, I rationalized it by telling myself how Jim might have been mistaken somehow. Maybe he was confusing Waldo Mountain with another Oregon lookout, or maybe even one up in Washington. He might have also gotten mixed up regarding what year this person went missing. Either way, I didn't want to alienate the only other person I could talk to for prolonged periods, someone who knew what it was like living at a fire lookout. Anyway, about a week later, Jim and I were talking one evening when he asked if Waldo Mountain was anywhere near Deschutes County. I had to check my map table, but lo and behold, WT National Forest was right on the border of Deschutes County. Jim went on to tell me that he had an old high school buddy who lived out near a place called Lapine, which, when I checked, was only around 25 miles from Waldo Mountain. Jim's high school buddy had checked in to say hi, but also to tell him a troubling story about a break-in that had occurred in his neighborhood just the previous night. Someone had broken into a family home completely silently, then crept up the stairs. But instead of robbing or hurting anyone, the intruder crept into the husband and wife's bedroom and just watched them sleep. The wife said she woke up, saw some shadowy figure looming over her, and screamed. Her scream woke up her husband, which prompted the intruder to hightail it out of there. No one was hurt, but the whole neighborhood was spooked. After the news hit the airwaves, the whole of Lapine and Deschutes County seemed to be on edge. I didn't need to ask why Jim told me all of that, and as I listened, I felt this icy chill run through me. I knew I was 25 miles away from where the break-in had happened, but I couldn't help but picture the intruder creeping up to my lookout before watching me sleep. I had my .38 with me, which made me feel a lot safer. But all the way out there, miles away from just about anything, no one would come running at the sound of my screams, because there would be no one there to hear them. I think Jim could tell how spooked I was because good old Jim seemed quick to reassure me. He didn't think I was in any real danger, but in light of the incident's proximity to Waldo Mountain, as well as what had supposedly happened there a year before, he figured it was worth giving me the heads up just in case. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the radio dialed into Jim's frequency, and he did the same with me. He checked in once or twice just to make sure that I was all right, and each time I only had good news to share. But on more than one occasion, I heard something from outside the lookout that had me clutching that .38, shining my flashlight through the dirty glass windows, and praying that I wouldn't see anyone approaching through the darkness. Thankfully, I never did. I heard a bunch of things that scared me just about out of my wits, but never anything that I felt might threaten my life. That same fear wasn't quite as strong the next night, and Jim reassured me that there hadn't been any more of those creepy break-ins over in Lapine. But still, it weighed on my mind for quite a few nights after, and I don't think I got more than 3 or 4 hours of solid sleep during each one. Then came the day when I finally got to talk to my district ranger over the ham radio and got the opportunity to ask him some follow-up questions regarding that missing volunteer from the year before. My district ranger, who had been in touch with the folks down in Clamo, said that there had been no record of anyone named Jim staffing any of their lookouts. This wasn't something that I could let go of, though, So I confronted Jim on it, and this is what he told me. He swore on his grandchildren's lives that he really was in an old fire lookout tower down in Klamath County. It just wasn't in service anymore, and neither was he. Jim told me that he'd spent 30 years in the Forest Service, and for his final 5, he had indeed spent every summer up in a fire lookout. Now, he was retired, but since his wife had passed, he found that he missed being out in nature during those long Oregon summers. With his old lookout being permanently freed up, he decided to head out there, fix it up a little, and then spend the summer steeped in nostalgia. Jim figured that he'd come off as some lonely old coot if he told me the truth, so instead, he told me a little white lie, never imagining that he'd eventually be found out. He swore that everything else he told me was the truth, especially all the stuff about the volunteer going missing. And truthfully, I believed him. It made perfect sense to me, as much as I needed it to, anyway. I just didn't want to lose that voice in the static, the one I was counting on more and more to keep me sane. The first few weeks had been a breeze, and although the addition of Jim had been welcome, it had not been entirely necessary. But then, toward my final week, week 6, I realized that I had just about reached the limits of my endurance for isolation, and I had actually started to consider Jim a good friend. With that in mind, you can imagine the fear that I felt one night when Jim got in touch over the radio with a distinct sound of terror in his voice. As I said, we had been keeping our radios tuned to one another's frequencies at night, just in case anything bad happened. It had been a quiet evening, but then, at around midnight, my radio suddenly burst to life with the sound of Jim's voice. "Jake, it's Jim," he said in a slow, shaky voice before asking, "Are you there? How copy?" "Over." Hearing the urgency in his voice, I rushed over to the radio and began asking him what was up. He then told me, in this frantic, fractured style of speech, that he'd heard someone moving around in the darkness outside his lookout tower. Then, after grabbing his flashlight and heading out onto the walkway outside his cabin, he realized that there were several dark figures in the woods surrounding him on 3 sides. Right away, I told Jim to get the hell off the frequency so he could call for help. But Jim then told me that he'd already tried to contact his HQ down in Klamath, but no one seemed to be manning the radio. He needed me to contact my Ranger HQ so that they could call the cops down in Klamath. I told him I'd do that right away, but before I could twist the frequency dial, I heard him shouting, "Wait!" Jim then started to explain, in the same terrified voice, that the cops needed to know which Pelican Butte to drive out to. Apparently, there was already a Pelican Butte campground down in Klamath County, and the cops needed to head to the old lookout tower Jim was manning, which was off Falls Highway near the 4M Flat Quarry. If I didn't pass along this crucial piece of information, Jim would be screwed. I remember frantically scribbling all that information down and asking Jim to repeat the name of the forest road he had mentioned at one point. And then, after waiting for his response, this is what I heard. Jim's voice suddenly broke through the static and said, "Oh God, they're coming up the stairs." I told him to lock and load the rifle he'd mentioned having with him, and to shoot anyone who came through the door to his cabin. I then heard Jim screaming, "Oh my God! Oh my God! What the hell are you people?" And the next thing I heard was a loud bang, then another and another. Jim let out a scream, and then, once his own had sort of petered out, something else unleashed an ear-splitting, inhuman roar before the transmission suddenly went quiet. I've faced some pretty terrifying moments in my life, but that right there might just take the cake. I thought I had just heard Jim, a man I'd grown remarkably close to over the previous 5 weeks, being shot to death in a lookout tower almost 100 miles from where I was sitting. I flew into a full-blown panic, trying desperately to dial into the frequency of the WUTHQ. Once I had one of the Rangers on the other end, I began to frantically relay everything I'd heard, including all the details about going to the correct location. Then, once they had promised to contact the Klamath County Sheriff, I switched back to Jim's frequency and began calling out to him across the airwaves. "Jim," I said. "Jim, are you there, buddy?" And the airwaves stayed silent. Nothing but the cold buzz of static. I begged him, to say something, say anything. I told him the cops were on their way, that he just needed to hang on and everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew things most probably were not. Jim had mentioned spotting several people circling his tower in the woods below him, which meant the odds were not in his favor. So when he set the radio's handset down, it hit me that the man I'd gotten to know so well over the previous 5 weeks had just been brutally murdered before my very ears. But then, just as my head sank down in my hands, the radio buzzed to life and someone began to speak. "Hello?" someone asked. The voice sounded like it belonged to a younger man. "Is anyone there?" I rushed over to the radio, announced my presence, and then asked where Jim was and if he was okay. In reply, and in a way that I could almost hear him grinning, he told me, "Sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Jim is dead." I heard laughter before the transmission cut out. In response, I started yelling about how they wouldn't get away with what they had just done. I told them the authorities were already on their way, that they were all going to rot in jail. But when I figured whoever was on the other end probably wasn't listening anymore, I ceased my rant and let go of the push-to-talk button, only to hear laughter coming from the other end. It was maniacal, gloating, satisfied. Just as I was leaning forward to change the frequency and rid myself of the taunting howls of a murderous stranger, they spoke once more. "You're so stupid," I heard them laughing. "I can't believe you sent the cops out there." The voice had changed almost completely, but in my confusion, I didn't quite realize what was going on yet. I reached over, picked up the handset, and once again asked where Jim was. "There is no Jim, you moron," I heard in reply. "It was me, this whole time, and you ate it up. What kind of sad, lonely piece of human trash are you? You ate up every word." I was speechless, stunned into a dumb silence, and all I could do was listen. "Goddamn," the young man said. "I knew I was good, but I didn't think I was that good." He let out another long, wheezing laugh. Then, once he pulled himself together a little, he asked if I was still there. I didn't know what else to say. I picked up the handset, and the first thing that came to mind was the first thing out of my mouth. "You should be ashamed of yourself," I said. "And you should off yourself," came the reply instantly, with the man screaming those last 2 words so loud they were almost lost in distortion. As I leaned over to the radio set to change the frequency, more of that same warped, maniacal laughter poured out from the small tinny speakers, only to be suddenly silenced with the twist of the dial. To say I felt foolish would be the understatement of the century. That guy dangled a little bait in the water, and not only did I bite, but I swallowed it hook, line, and sinker too. There was no Jim. There was no missing volunteer lookout from the year before. But then again, I bet some of you figured that one out a long way back. I also bet that guy knew so much about being a fire lookout because he'd talked to one a whole bunch, most likely using the same ham radio he used to talk to me. Then, I don't know, maybe what was intended as a one-time prank just snowballed. It wouldn't be too hard to fake all those sounds either. The gunshots and the screams, I mean. But what must have been difficult for anyone in their right mind was having the patience to drag me through a 5-week-long con before delivering that horrifying final performance. That's what, for me at least, makes this all seem like a lot more than just a playful prank. He didn't just string me along for a day or two, call me a sucker, and then disappear from the airwaves to waste some other radio operator's time. He kept things going for more than a month. He put hours into talking to me, into building his character and earning my trust. He put on the gravelly smoker's voice of a man in his 60s, and he did so for hours upon hours upon hours. Then, in the end, the kid, I guess, who ended up screaming at me through the airwaves sounded like his balls had only just dropped. He made me believe in a person who didn't exist, and as much as that speaks to the sheer magnitude of my own idiocy, I think it says a lot about his being a psycho too. I spent the rest of my final week in a kind of semi-depressed daze. I felt like the single stupidest person on the face of the earth, a weak-minded, pathetic excuse for a man who got so lonely that he fell for the dumb prank of a bored, psychopathic teenager. And that's the thing, too. I didn't just fall for it one time. I fell for it again and again and again. Every time I picked up that handset and started talking to Jim, I let that black-hearted little brat take me for a ride all over again. I'd been humiliated, stripped of any and all pride, and when the time came to leave the lookout, I was only too happy to put the whole thing behind me. The sun was just starting to dip behind the mountains when the call came through. It was the kind of light that turned the trees into long, jagged shadows, casting an orange hue over everything, making the forest look both beautiful and a little sinister at the same time. I was standing on the porch of the ranger station, my back sore from another day in the field, thinking about nothing in particular. Then the radio crackled to life. "Ian, you there?" It was Kyle, the new guy. Fresh as they come, but eager. He was stationed up near the old fire watch tower, abandoned for years now since the budget cuts. I raised the radio to my mouth. "Go ahead, Kyle." There was a pause, too long. A crackle of static filled the silence, and then I heard it, the sound of his breathing. Fast and uneven. Fear. I think something's out here," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What are you talking about?" I asked, a knot of unease forming in my gut. "Is it a bear?" No, not a bear. Something else. Something's not right." The knot tightened. "Stay calm, Kyle. Where are you exactly?" "By the watchtower, near the North Ridge. I thought I saw something in the trees." The radio cut out, and what came next made my blood run cold. A sound low and guttural like an animal, but not quite. It was a sound that didn't belong to anything I knew in these woods. The radio crackled once more, a blood-curdling scream. And then, nothing. Silence. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my hand gripping the radio so tight my knuckles were white. The air around me seemed to still, thick with something I couldn't name. I could feel the others inside the station staring at me, waiting. Jess was the first to speak, her voice cutting through the heavy quiet. "What the hell was that?" she asked, stepping outside. Jess was our tracker, a seasoned ranger who could find anything or anyone in these woods. But even she looked rattled. I lowered the radio slowly, my mind already racing. "Kyle's in trouble. He's by the old fire watchtower. We need to go, now." James, the biologist, came to the door next. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, that permanent skeptical expression on his face. "You really think it's something dangerous? Could be just a mountain lion, maybe even a wolf. Nothing to panic about." But I'd heard panic in Kyle's voice. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a mountain lion. I could feel it in my bones. "I don't know what it is," I admitted, "but we're not leaving him out there alone." I looked to Trevor, the youngest of the group, fresh out of training. His face was pale, and he shifted nervously from foot to foot. He didn't want to go. Hell, I didn't want to go either. But leaving Kyle out there? Not an option. "We leave in 5, I said, already moving to grab my gear. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my face calm. We had a job to do, and if I let fear get the better of me, we'd all be in trouble. As we headed out, the sky darkened into twilight, the forest around us sinking into that thick, oppressive silence. It wasn't normal. Even the birds had gone quiet. We moved quickly, the crunch of leaves under our boots the only sound, but something felt off. The usual life of the woods was absent. No rustling in the underbrush, no distant howls, just nothing. Jess walked ahead, her eyes scanning the ground, tracking Kyle's path. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was on edge, her movements a little too tense. James kept muttering under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. And Trevor stayed close, his head on a constant swivel, wide-eyed like a deer caught in headlights. As we approached the old fire watchtower, I noticed the way the trees seemed to close in around us, casting long, crooked shadows that made it feel like we were being watched. The tower stood like a ghost against the sky, a dark silhouette looming over the forest. And then I saw it, Kyle's pack lying at the base of the tower, but no sign of Kyle. My heart sank. Something wasn't right. I knelt next to the pack, scanning the area for any sign of a struggle. Nothing. The air was heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't explain. I looked up at the watchtower. Its rusted frame creaked in the wind, but otherwise it was silent, too silent. "We'll split up," I said, my voice low. "Jess, check the tree line. James, look around the base. Trevor, stay with me." But as the words left my mouth, a new sound cut through the air. A voice, faint but clear. "Ian, help." It was Kyle. But something in the tone wasn't right. The forest had swallowed us whole. The fading light from the sky barely pierced through the thick canopy overhead. It was just shadows now, dark, tangled branches and trunks stretching into the dusk. The deeper we went, the quieter it became, like the woods were holding their breath. Every step felt like an intrusion, like we weren't supposed to be here. We'd been walking for about an hour, but it felt longer. Jess, as usual, was ahead, eyes fixed on the ground, picking up signs that none of the rest of us could see. I kept glancing around, uneasy, the weight of Kyle's last transmission gnawing at me. The guy had been spooked, seriously spooked, and now we were heading straight into whatever had caused it. James, always the skeptic, pushed through the brush behind me, breathing hard. He wasn't exactly built for long treks in the wilderness. "This is getting ridiculous, Ian," he muttered. "You're seriously telling me you believe in this? Whatever it is, skinwalkers, supernatural nonsense? You know what's more likely? Kyle got scared by a bear or a wolf and he's hiding somewhere." I didn't answer right away, just kept moving. I wanted to believe that too. But that sound over the radio, whatever it had been, was still in my head, curling around my thoughts like a snake. It wasn't something I'd heard before, and I'd spent my life in these woods. "James," I said after a long pause, "I don't know what I believe, but something scared him, and we need to find out what." Ahead, Jess had stopped. She was crouched low, studying something on the ground. Trevor and I moved toward her, James huffing as he caught up. "What is it?" I asked. She pointed silently. There, caught on a low branch, was a strip of fabric, green, like the ranger uniforms we all wore. It was torn, ragged at the edges, and stained with something dark. My stomach twisted. "Kyle's?" Trevor asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jess nodded, her face grim. She stood, brushing dirt off her knees. "His trail goes further into the trees, but I'm not liking what I'm seeing." I knew what she meant. We'd all noticed it. Claw marks, gouged deep into the trunks of the surrounding trees. Whatever had left them was big, too high up to be from a bear, too wide to be a mountain lion. I ran my fingers over one of the marks, trying to picture what kind of creature could have done this. Nothing I could think of matched. "What the hell made those?" Trevor asked, taking a step back, his eyes darting around, scanning the shadows like something might leap out at us. "Nothing good," Jess answered flatly. "We need to move, fast." She was right. The woods were starting to feel alive, like something was watching us. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to head back to the ranger station and wait until daylight, but Kyle was still out here, and I couldn't leave him behind. We pushed forward, following Jess as she tracked deeper into the forest. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the usual sounds of the woods, birds, insects, the rustle of animals in the brush, were completely absent. It was like the whole forest had gone still, waiting for something to happen. "Look," Jess said quietly, pointing ahead. I followed her gaze and saw it, a cabin, barely visible through the trees. The roof sagged, and the walls were worn, but it was still standing. "That's Noah's place," I said. The old man lived way out here, keeping mostly to himself. I hadn't seen him in years. He was a Native American shaman, or so the rumors went. People said he knew things about the forest, things most of us didn't want to know. As we approached, the door creaked open, and Noah stepped out, his weathered face unreadable. He didn't seem surprised to see us. "Ian," he greeted me, his voice rough as gravel. "You've come looking for your young friend." I nodded. "Kyle. He's gone missing near the old fire watchtower." Noah's dark eyes flicked to the others, then back to me. "You shouldn't be here?" he said simply. I waited, but he didn't elaborate. Frustration bubbled up inside me. "What do you mean? You know something, don't you?" He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the tree line. There's something old in these woods, something that doesn't belong to this world. It hunts under the moon, takes many shapes. Your young friend?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's not lost. He's been taken." James scoffed, shaking his head. "You can't be serious." But I was serious. Noah's words sent a chill down my spine, like ice water flowing through my veins. Taken by what? "The watchtower was built on land that wasn't meant for men," Noah continued, his voice low and heavy with meaning. "It's a place of power, but also of danger, and now you're walking right into its grasp." Jess shifted beside me, her jaw tight. "We need to find Kyle." Noah met her gaze. "If you go further, you'll find more than your friend, and you may not like what you see." I glanced back at the forest. The trees seemed to press closer, the shadows deeper. Something was out there, waiting. The sun disappeared faster than I'd expected, swallowed up by the thick tangle of trees that closed in around us. The darkness didn't creep in. It fell, hard, like a curtain dropping after a show. One minute, there was a faint glow in the distance. The next, nothing. Just shadows and the faint rustling of wind through the treetops. But even the wind felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. Jess was the first to suggest we set up camp, but we all knew it was more out of necessity than comfort. Our pace had slowed, tension growing with each step, and we hadn't seen a trace of Kyle for hours. Just his pack, some torn fabric, and those claw marks on the trees. Whatever was out here, it wasn't going to let us find him easily. We cleared a small patch of ground just off the path, far enough from the thickest of the trees, but close enough to feel trapped. I could see it in their faces. Jess, James, Trevor, they were all trying to act like everything was under control, like this was just another night out in the wilderness. But none of us believed it. "Fire," Jess said quietly, gathering dry branches. "It'll keep the animals away." But we all knew it wasn't animals we were worried about anymore. James didn't say much, which was unusual for him. Normally, he'd be full of explanations, trying to make sense of everything with his wildlife biology degree, dismissing anything he couldn't explain with logic and facts. But not now. The look on his face told me he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Trevor was the worst off. He sat hunched over near the fire, hugging his knees like a scared kid, eyes darting to every rustle, every crack of a twig in the darkness. I could hear his breath quickening, feel the tension rising in him like a coiled spring ready to snap. "We're fine," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. "We've been through worse, right?" But no one answered. The fire flickered weakly, throwing twisted shadows against the trees. The woods seemed to move around us, closing in just out of reach of the light. That oppressive silence, so thick you could feel it pressing down on your chest, lingered. And I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. We sat there, staring into the flames, pretending it was enough to keep the darkness at bay. Then, without warning, a sound cut through the stillness. A voice. "Help, please," Kyle's voice. Trevor shot up from his spot, eyes wide. "Kyle!" he yelled, taking a step toward the trees. "Wait!" I grabbed his arm, yanking him back. He looked at me, confused and desperate, but I kept my grip firm. There was something off about that voice, something not quite right. It was too faint, too distant, like it wasn't coming from anywhere at all, just hanging in the air around us. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone, swallowed up by the woods. "That wasn't him," Jess said softly, eyes scanning the dark tree line. "It sounded like him," Trevor argued, "but it wasn't." He shook his head. "You don't know that. He could be out there, hurt, scared. We can't just leave him." "We're not leaving him," I said. "But running off into the dark isn't going to help either. We stick together. If that was Kyle, we'll find him." I gestured toward the trees. But that didn't feel right. Trevor's resolve cracked. His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but no words came out. Instead, he just nodded, eyes still darting nervously toward the trees. We all stayed close to the fire after that. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I kept listening for that voice, but it didn't come again. Instead, there were other sounds. Quiet, almost imperceptible at first. A snapping branch, the shuffle of something moving through the underbrush. Jess stiffened beside me, her hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on her belt. Then came the growl. Low, guttural, like something big, something dangerous, just beyond the circle of firelight. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. James, who had been staring into the flames, looked up, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, eyes wide. We all stood, weapons ready, scanning the darkness. The growl came again. Closer this time. I could feel it reverberate in my chest, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the ground beneath us. My heart pounded, adrenaline flooding my veins. Every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then the growl stopped, replaced by a sickening silence. We waited, tense, expecting something to leap out of the shadows. But instead, it was Trevor who broke the stillness. His voice cracked, barely audible. I turned toward him, just in time to see his wide, terrified eyes, before he disappeared into the darkness. Gone. Just like that. His radio hit the ground with a soft thud, the only thing left of him. Then it crackled to life, and through the static came Trevor's voice. "Help! I'm here." But it wasn't him. The fire watchtower loomed over us like a forgotten monument, barely visible in the gloom. Its rusted frame creaked in the wind, a skeleton of what it once was. We stumbled toward it, driven by pure instinct and fear, Trevor's disappearance still fresh in our minds. The ground felt like it was shifting under my feet, every step heavier than the last, as though the forest itself didn't want us to reach the tower. Jess was limping beside me, her breath ragged and shallow. She had twisted her ankle when we'd run from the campsite after Trevor vanished, but she refused to slow down. I could see the pain etched on her face, but we both knew stopping wasn't an option, not with whatever was out there stalking us. James trailed behind, pale and silent, his disbelief finally shattered by what we'd witnessed. The thing in the forest wasn't an animal. It wasn't something any of us had ever dealt with. I glanced back at him, his eyes wide and wild, like a man on the edge of losing it completely. "You hanging in there, James?" He didn't answer at first, just kept moving, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I don't know what's out there," he muttered. "I thought it was maybe just some predator. But it's not." His voice cracked. "It's real," I said grimly, "and it's coming." We reached the base of the tower, and my hand instinctively went to the ladder. I craned my neck, looking up. The old wooden platform was barely visible in the dim light, just a dark outline against the sky. I didn't like the idea of going up there. It felt like a trap, but staying on the ground wasn't an option either. "Up," I said, pushing Jess ahead of me. "Let's move." One by one, we climbed, the old rungs creaking under our weight. My pulse pounded in my ears, my senses screaming at me to keep moving, keep climbing. Behind us, the forest was too quiet. No more growling, no more rustling, just that suffocating silence, like the whole world was holding its breath. We reached the top and clambered onto the platform. It swayed under our weight, groaning in protest, but it held. The view from up here was terrifying. Nothing but blackness in every direction, the forest stretching out like an endless ocean of trees. And yet, I felt exposed. The tower wasn't a sanctuary. It was a perch, and whatever was out there could see us. James crouched by the edge, gripping the railing with white knuckles. "We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have." His voice was barely more than a whisper, panic seeping into every word. "Get a grip, James," I snapped. "We didn't have a choice." Then I saw it. The blood. It was smeared across the floorboards, a dark, dried stain that trailed toward the corner. My stomach lurched as I recognized the mark. Kyle had been here. This was where it had taken him. "Ian," Jess said, her voice low, "we need to keep moving." But before I could respond, there it was again, a voice, faint and distant, floating up from below. "Ian, Jess, help me." "Kyle, not anymore." "Don't listen to it," I said, louder than I meant to. "It's not him." But the voice kept coming. Closer now. Clearer. "Please, Ian, help me." I backed away from the edge, my hand tightening on the grip of the rifle slung across my shoulder. Then, an explosion of sound from below. Branches snapping. Something large crashing through the underbrush. It was circling the tower. Then, silence. James stood suddenly, his face pale as a ghost. I can hear him," he said. I turned and saw them. Two glowing yellow eyes just beyond the tree line. Too high up to belong to anything normal. Too bright. Too wrong. James didn't scream. He didn't make a sound. As something pulled him into the darkness, the sound of snapping branches and tearing flesh filled the night. Jess clutched my arm, her breath ragged. What do we do? I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. We wait. But even as I said it, I knew. There was no waiting. The thing had found us, and now it was just a matter of time. Below us, the voice came again. Soft, pleading. Ian, please. I closed my eyes, gripping my rifle tighter. It was going to come for us next. The forest was alive with the sound of something hunting us. The skinwalker circled below, unseen but unmistakably there, its movements too fast, too erratic. We could hear it growl, reverberating through the trees, a low guttural sound that sent ice-cold terror through my veins. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me gripping the rifle tighter, but I knew a gun wasn't going to stop whatever was down there. Jess crouched beside me, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her face pale, streaked with sweat and dirt. Neither of us spoke, both listening to the sound of the creature prowling below, waiting for it to make its move. The fire watchtower swayed slightly under the pressure of the wind, or maybe under the pressure of something worse, something that didn't care whether or not we had high ground. I don't think it's going to stop, Jess whispered, her voice raw, barely a thread of sound. I swallowed hard. No, it won't. It's playing with us. The creature was relentless. Every few minutes it would let out a sound, sometimes like Kyle's voice, sometimes like a deep, ragged breath, always pulling at our nerves, making it impossible to think straight. The rifle felt useless in my hands. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a wolf. This was something older, darker, and it was feeding off our fear. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed up from below. Something had hit the tower, hard. The whole platform shuddered, sending splinters flying up from the old rotten wood. I grabbed Jess, pulling her back from the edge just as another thud shook the entire structure. "It's trying to knock the tower down," Jess said, her voice barely above a whisper, eyes wide with panic. "We can't stay up here," I said, scanning the surrounding forest. The trees were just a blur of black shadows, but the sense of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. We were running out of options. If it brought the tower down, we'd be sitting ducks. Another loud crash, and the tower groaned under the force. I felt the platform shift beneath us, my heart racing. If we didn't move, this thing was going to tear the whole place apart. "We've got to make a run for it," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Now, before it brings us down." Jess nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. She gripped her knife tighter, even though we both knew it wouldn't do much against what waited for us in the trees. I threw the rifle over my shoulder, slung low, and moved toward the ladder. "Stay close. We run straight for Noah's cabin. If we can make it to his land, maybe it won't follow." I didn't wait for her to respond. I grabbed the ladder and began my descent, the wood creaking beneath my weight. Every second felt like a lifetime. I kept expecting the skinwalker to grab me, yank me off the ladder, and drag me into the dark, but nothing came. Jess was right behind me, her breathing sharp and fast. As soon as my boots hit the ground, I spun around, scanning the forest. The growling had stopped. The forest was eerily still, too still. "Let's go," I said, grabbing her arm, and we bolted. The woods closed in around us immediately. The shadows deeper, thicker, like the trees themselves wanted to slow us down. We ran hard, dodging branches, our boots pounding against the uneven ground. I could hear Jess just behind me, her breath ragged and desperate, but we didn't slow down. Behind us, there was a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of something large moving fast through the trees. "It's coming," Jess yelled, her voice trembling with terror. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. The howling started again, low at first, then rising, gaining speed, getting closer. It was right behind us. I could feel it. "Faster," I urged, pushing Jess ahead of me. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest, but we couldn't stop. Not now. The howling turned into a series of distorted, mocking cries, like the skinwalker was shifting voices, trying to confuse us, unsettle us. Sometimes it sounded like Kyle, sometimes like Trevor, sometimes like something far worse. We were running blind, crashing through the underbrush, barely able to see where we were going. The only goal was Noah's cabin. If we could just make it there, maybe the skinwalker would stop. Maybe. There, Jess cried out, pointing ahead. Through the darkness, I saw it, a faint light, barely visible through the trees. Noah's cabin. It was so close, but the skinwalker was even closer. The ground beneath us shook with its footsteps now, the heavy thud of claws tearing through the earth. I could hear its breath, ragged and animalistic, and the unnatural growl that sent chills down my neck. We burst through the last line of trees, stumbling into the small clearing that surrounded Noah's cabin. The creature was so close now. I could feel its presence, feel its eyes burning into my back. "Noah!" I screamed, my voice hoarse, desperate. "Noah, help!" Just as we reached the porch, I felt something, hot, wet breath on the back of my neck. The skinwalker was right behind us, but then as soon as my foot hit the first step of the porch, the growling stopped. The air was suddenly still. I collapsed onto the porch, gasping for breath, my heart thudding in my ears. Jess crouched beside me, shaking, her eyes wide with terror. I turned slowly, expecting to see the creature barreling toward us. But there was nothing. The edge of the forest stood silent, dark, as if nothing had been chasing us at all. The door to the cabin creaked open, and Noah stepped out, his eyes calm but heavy with understanding. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. We'd made it. Barely. But the skinwalker, it was still out there, watching us from the trees, and I knew this wasn't over. Way back in 2015, I first saw that photo, the one that changed my life. There she was, a young woman sitting on a bed with the most breathtaking view of pine-dotted mountains behind her. I remember thinking, if that's her home, what do I have to do to live in that kind of coniferous paradise? I did some research and found out that the woman wasn't living there permanently. She was a fire lookout. She stayed up there for months at a time and got paid for it. From that moment, I was obsessed. Living the life of a fire lookout for a summer seemed like the adventure of a lifetime. I thought it would be easy to get into, but I was wrong on both counts. When I first applied in 2015, I was way underqualified and got rejected within days. That stung, but it also ignited a fire in me. I did volunteer work, built up my resume with stints at community gardens, and even spent some time at the National Arboretum. By the time 2016 rolled around, I thought I had a fighting chance. But after weeks of hoping and praying, I got another rejection. This one hurt twice as much. I'd put in the work, but it still wasn't enough. It took 2 more years of grinding, applying, and getting rejected. By the time I applied for the 2017 season, just before the 2016 holidays, I was so jaded that I made alternative plans for the summer. That way, the rejection would be like water off a duck's back. And then, the only time I actually planned not to be accepted was the year I finally was. I remember opening the email with shaking hands. When I read the words, "Congratulations, you've been assigned to Gold Mountain Lookout," I felt a mix of disbelief and elation. I'd waited 4 years for this, and it was finally happening. Gold Mountain, the tallest live-in tower in Washington state, would be my home for the next 3 months. I caught a red-eye from Portland to Spokane, landed in the early morning, and drove 170 miles out to Gold Mountain with my truck rental. The place was surprisingly easy to locate, with its own access road, Gold Mountain Lookout Drive. When I arrived mid-morning, a friendly forest ranger met me. We went over a few final details, and he handed me the keys. His big, warm smile and the way he asked if I had any second thoughts made me laugh. I was too excited to back out now. Once he left, I was alone. The isolation was both thrilling and daunting. I danced a little jig as I went to retrieve my stuff, feeling on top of the world. The only downsides were having to use a nearby creek to wash myself and walking down to the bottom of the tower to use the chemical toilet. But the pros outweighed the cons by a mile. For the first few days, everything was perfect. I loved the solitude, the peace, and the spectacular views. It was everything I dreamed of. But there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Be careful what you wish for. The nights were the hardest. I didn't scare easily, but the noises in the woods at night were unnerving. The wind howled around the tower, making it creak like an old ship. I told myself it was just the wind, but the fear of something more sinister lingered. Every creak and groan felt like a footstep, every rustle of leaves like a whisper. One night, as I lay in bed with my heart racing, I realized that this dream of mine wasn't going to be all about peace and solitude. There was something out there, something watching, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. The isolation grew on me faster than I expected. Each day was a new adventure, and I quickly fell into a routine. Wake up, check for fires, maintain the equipment, log the weather, and enjoy the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched out before me. It was everything I'd imagined and more. But there was always that gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. The creek was my lifeline for washing up, and it was about 100 meters from the lookout tower. The first few times, I was apprehensive, constantly looking over my shoulder. It felt like someone, or something, was watching me. But I convinced myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I'd come here for solitude, after all, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin it. Then one day, as I made my way down to the creek, I saw him, a man crouched on the opposite side, dressed like a typical hiker but built like a linebacker. He had dark hair and glasses that gave him a nerdy look, but there was something off about him. My first instinct was to turn back. I forced myself to keep going. After all, he might just be another hiker passing through. "Hey there! Nice day for a hike," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I approached the creek. He looked up, startled, and then stood up slowly. "Yeah, it is," he replied, but his eyes lingered on me longer than I liked. I stepped into the water, pretending to wash my hands, all the while keeping an eye on him. He seemed curious, asking what I was doing out here all alone. "I'm a fire lookout," I explained, trying to sound casual. "I stay up in the tower and monitor for fires." "All by yourself?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Yes, but I have a radio and bear mace," I said, holding up the canister as if to prove a point. "I'm perfectly safe." He didn't seem convinced, but he nodded and eventually walked away. I watched him go, a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. There was something about his demeanor that unsettled me. I finished washing up quickly and hurried back to the tower. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. My nights became more restless, each creak of the tower and howl of the wind making it harder to sleep. Then, a week later, I saw him again. I was down at the creek, and there he was, sitting on a rock as if waiting for me. My heart sank. This time, his presence wasn't a coincidence. He was there for me. "Hello again," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was hoping I'd run into you." "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I just think it's dangerous for someone to be out here all alone," he replied, standing up and taking a step toward me. "You should have someone to watch your back." "I don't need anyone to watch my back," I said, stepping away from him. "I'm fine on my own." His smile faded, replaced by a look of frustration. "You're not safe out here, Jessica. Anything could happen." The way he said my name sent chills down my spine. I backed away, gripping my bear mace tightly. "Stay away from me," I warned. He didn't listen. Instead, he took another step toward me, his eyes dark with determination. "I'm just trying to help." I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran back to the tower, my heart pounding in my chest. As I climbed the steps, I glanced back and saw him watching me, his expression unreadable. Back in the safety of the tower, I locked the door and sank to the floor, my hands shaking. The dream of solitude and peace had turned into a nightmare. I wasn't alone out here, and I wasn't safe. A week passed after that second encounter, but I never felt at ease. My once peaceful sanctuary now felt like a prison. Every shadow and rustle outside was a potential threat. I tried to focus on my duties, keeping a watchful eye on the horizon for signs of fire, but my mind kept drifting back to Tony. His words haunted me. "You're not safe out here, Jessica." It was late one night when it happened. The crickets had been singing their usual chorus, and I was beginning to drift off when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A footstep on the steel stairs below. My eyes flew open, and my heart pounded in my chest. I lay there listening, hoping it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again. The distinct clink of a boot on metal. Someone was climbing the stairs. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, pulling on my boots and grabbing the bear mace and taser. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to steady myself. "I know someone's out there," I called out, my voice trembling but loud. "I've got a gun, and I'm about to call the Rangers." There was a moment of silence. Then I heard his voice. "You're not safe out here, Jessica." That same flat, scolding tone. It was Tony. Fear surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "If you try to come in here, I'll push you off the tower," I shouted. "Get out of here now!" His footsteps continued, slowly, methodically. He was getting closer. Through the gaps in the floor, I could see his shadow moving up the stairs. My hands shook, but I held the bear mace ready, my thumb on the trigger. Then, Tony's face appeared at the window, illuminated by the faint moonlight. His twisted expression of anger and determination sent a fresh wave of terror through me. He didn't say anything this time. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and cold. Then he reached for the door handle. "Don't you dare!" I screamed, and without hesitation I sprayed the bear mace directly at his face. He recoiled, howling in pain, but he didn't back down. Instead, he lunged forward, trying to push his way into the cabin. I dodged his grasp, my heart racing. He was strong, and I knew I couldn't let him get his hands on me. I grabbed the taser and jabbed it into his side. He screamed, a horrible guttural sound, and fell back against the wall. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Leave me alone." Tony staggered, trying to regain his balance. I hit him with the taser again, and he collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony. For a moment, I thought he might pass out, but he managed to drag himself toward the stairs. I followed him, my heart still pounding. I gave him one last blast of bear mace as he descended, making sure he wouldn't turn back. He stumbled down the steps, cursing and groaning, until he disappeared into the darkness below. I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the radio. I called the Rangers, my voice trembling as I reported the attack. By the time they arrived, Tony was long gone. They searched the area but found no sign of him. The Rangers were sympathetic, but their reassurances did little to calm my nerves. The police were called, and they questioned me extensively. But without solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Tony had vanished into the night, leaving me with nothing but fear and the gnawing dread that he might come back. The once serene and beautiful lookout tower now felt like a fortress under siege, and I was its lone defender, always waiting, always watching, never truly at peace. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Every noise, every movement in the forest below set my nerves on edge. I barely slept. The cricket song, which once lulled me to sleep, now kept me awake. Each chirp felt like a countdown to another terrifying encounter with Tony. I kept the bear mace and taser within arm's reach, constantly reminding myself of their presence, a flimsy barrier against the relentless dread. One night, as I sat by the window, scanning the dark tree line, I saw a shadow move. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees. I tried to calm myself, but my mind was a whirlwind of fear and anxiety. The Rangers were kind, but there was only so much they could do. They patrolled the area more frequently and reassured me that Tony had likely moved on. But their words were hollow. I knew better. Tony wasn't just a passerby. He was a predator, and I was his prey. I kept my radio close, checking in with the Rangers more often than necessary. They didn't mind. They understood my fear. Each time I pressed the button and heard their voices, a small measure of calm washed over me. But it never lasted long. One particularly cold and windy night, I was jolted awake by a sound I had come to dread, the creak of the stairs. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The wind howled around the tower, making it difficult to discern specific noises. I strained my ears, hoping, praying that it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, a distinct, deliberate footstep on the metal stairs. I grabbed the bear mace and taser, my hands trembling. This time, I didn't call out. I waited. My breath was shallow. My pulse raced. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could see a shadow moving up the stairs. As the shadow reached the top, I shone my flashlight directly at it, illuminating Tony's twisted, furious face. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression one of pure rage. "You're not safe out here, Jessica," he hissed, echoing his previous threat. Before he could take another step, I sprayed the bear mace directly into his face. He screamed, a guttural, animalistic sound, and stumbled back. I didn't wait for him to recover. I jabbed the taser into his side, sending volts of electricity through his body. He convulsed, collapsing onto the stairs. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice raw with fear and anger. "Get out and never come back!" Tony managed to crawl down the stairs, his screams of pain echoing through the night. I watched him go, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. When he was finally out of sight, I ran back into the cabin and locked the door. The dream I had once cherished was now a ghost, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk even in the most beautiful places. I pulled into the campground just before sunset, expecting the usual, a few quiet families roasting marshmallows, maybe a couple of seasoned hikers turning in early. Instead, I was greeted by the clamor of loud music echoing off the tree line. The source? A cluster of tents circled around a blazing fire where a group of frat boys hollered and laughed like they had the whole place to themselves. Every so often, other campers peeked out of their tents, uneasy and clearly wishing these guys would tone it down. I couldn't blame them. Noise doesn't just shatter the calm of a campsite, it draws attention from things best left undisturbed. Out here, folks whisper about the ghost cats, those local mountain lions known to slip into camps without warning. I'd seen enough tracks in eerily close proximity to sleeping bags to know these stories were more than just rumors. I parked my rig a little ways off and walked over, picking my path carefully around scattered coolers and folding chairs. As I got close, the frat boys paused their banter, giving me that half-attentive look. They were mostly older teens or early 20-somethings, still buzzing with alcohol and late-night bravado. "Evening," I started, trying to keep it friendly but firm. "I'm the ranger on duty. Got some other campers worried you're attracting unwanted attention." I motioned toward the looming tree line. These woods have a reputation, and it's not for the best sing-alongs. They laughed it off at first, so I leaned in, lowering my voice. I described how mountain lions sometimes stalk the perimeter of noisy camps, how you won't spot them until they're practically brushing against your tent walls. I explained how we call them ghost cats because of their uncanny silence, the way they seem to appear out of nowhere. They sobered up a bit. A couple exchanged uncertain glances, but one just shrugged, muttering that they'd keep it down. I issued a final warning anyway. "Stay quiet, don't wander off, and if you hear anything odd outside in the dark, make no sound." I only hoped they'd actually listen. Once I'd done all I could, I headed back to the station. My buddy Jim was there, flipping through some old wildlife photos. He raised an eyebrow when I told him about the frat boys. "Let me guess, blasting music, ignoring every rule we've got, right?" he said, clearly unimpressed. "Bingo," I replied. "And they're not taking the mountain lion threat seriously." He let out a quiet laugh that contained zero humor. We both knew this was more than a minor annoyance. If something did happen, we'd be the ones hauling them out, or dealing with an injured cat that got too comfortable around humans. That's when we started talking about a plan. Not to harm anyone, obviously, but to rattle them enough that they'd finally grasp the gravity of a place like this. Jim reminded me about the old lion pelt in our interpretive center. Used it once or twice for educational tours. Though it always gave me the creeps, its glass eyes caught the light in this unnerving way, like it was still alive. We also had night vision goggles stashed away, thanks to a budget splurge before the new fiscal year. Perfect for sneaking around in the dark, unseen by unsuspecting campers. Over the next half hour, we pieced together a strategy: fake prints, hidden growls, and a well-timed appearance of a lion silhouette. It might just be the jolt they needed to pack up, or at the very least, dial down the party volume. Grabbing the pelt from a dusty storage closet, I noticed the faint, musty smell of fur mixed with something almost medicinal. I ran my hand over the stiff mane, shivering at how realistic it still felt. Next, we tested the night vision goggles. Even in the dim station lights, they turned everything into an eerie green that made my pulse spike. By the time we had our gear ready, the sun had slipped below the horizon. The woods outside transformed into a dark maze. I had this sense that the frat boys, oblivious in their tents, were about to discover that being out here isn't just a carefree getaway. If they refused to respect the campground's unspoken rules, well, we'd give them a night they wouldn't forget. Jim killed the overhead lights as we locked up. We checked our plan one last time, and I took a breath, settling my nerves. We were about to sneak into that campsite, loaded with props and a fair share of wild imagination. In the back of my mind, I thought about the actual ghost cats prowling these hills. I hoped we wouldn't run into a real one while pulling our prank. It's one thing to frighten a few campers. It's another to come face to face with the genuine article. Still, I felt this rush of adrenaline as we set off into the darkness. Maybe it was the satisfaction of delivering a wake-up call. Or maybe it was just that strange, hushed energy you feel whenever you realize you're not at the top of the food chain out here. Either way, there was no turning back. We had our plan, and we were committed to seeing it through. The night was only getting darker, and the silent woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting for whatever came next. I hunched down in the cramped front seat of our Jeep, double-checking that the lion pelt was still tucked out of sight. Outside, moonlight drenched the forest in faint silver, and every rustle of wind through the branches made me brace for actual movement. I couldn't help scanning the dark spaces between the trees, searching for any flicker of eyes that might belong to the real thing. My coworker Jim was fidgeting in the passenger seat, adjusting the small PA system we'd use for the recorded roars. "Ready?" he asked, voice low. "As I'll ever be," I replied, half hoping those frat kids were already asleep and half itching to put our plan into action. Either way, we needed to move quickly. The night sky was starless, and visibility would only get worse. I eased the Jeep toward their campsite, headlights off to keep our approach silent. Stopping a good distance away, we slipped out and quietly shut the doors. The path under our boots was damp from an earlier drizzle, which made our footfalls softer, but also gave the soil a perfect texture for stamping fake tracks. One by one, we planted oversized paw prints in the mud, making sure to press deeply near the tents. Every so often, we paused to listen, worried someone inside might stir and peek outside. But all we heard was the faint crackle of a dying fire. Next, Jim propped the lion pelt onto two sturdy sticks we duct-taped together. Seen straight on, it was eerily convincing. Massive head, snarling mouth, and the kind of glassy eyes that appeared to stare into your soul. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting an actual animal to emerge, drawn by the uncanny shape. With the pelt set up, we turned to the other part of our plan, the roars. We'd preloaded the PA system with a series of snarls and growls from real mountain lion recordings. Jim started them at a low volume from across the clearing. The first noise rumbled through the darkness like a threat, and I could almost sense the campers tensing in their tents. A second roar followed, echoing off the surrounding trees, making it sound as if multiple predators were encircling the area. I slipped back into the Jeep and carefully flicked on the headlights, aiming them so they backlit the pelt. From the angle of the beam, it looked like a living, breathing cat pacing along the outskirts of the camp. Jim shouted from behind a bush, "Stay in your tents!" His voice shook with just enough panic to convince anyone he was facing a genuine attack. "She's moving around us," he hollered, layering more drama into the moment. Then he bellowed, "There's another one." The reaction inside those tents was instant. Muffled cries, frantic rustling, the scrape of tent zippers being yanked shut. I killed the lights in one sudden click. Darkness swallowed the campsite. Jim dropped the sticks, and we ditched the lion pelt. In under a minute, we tore back to the Jeep, adrenaline hammering through every vein. As I started the engine and sped off, I thought I detected one final roar playing through the PA system, echoing behind us like a last warning. When dawn finally broke, the camp's radio chatter indicated that nobody had poked their head out until well into the morning. From our station windows, we could imagine their pale faces and wide eyes discovering the huge paw prints scattered around, some alarmingly close to their tent doors. We heard they packed up not long after, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders at the looming forest. No doubt, they were rattled to the core. Jim and I swapped glances, both relieved to hear they were safe, but also satisfied we'd given them something to think about. We'd wanted them to respect these woods, or at least remember that nature doesn't tolerate fools. From what we heard later, they told everyone about the mountain lion attack they'd barely survived. Maybe next time, they'd remember that out here. Silence can be the difference between a peaceful night and something far more dangerous. My name is Mara Caldwell, and I'm 28 years old. This happened along Paint Creek Scenic Trail in West Virginia during a trip I'd planned to reconnect with my art, and frankly, myself. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of the world, but instead, it became something I still can't fully explain. I had just come off a long relationship that ended in the kind of breakup that leaves you questioning everything. Your choices, your direction, your worth. Art was the only thing that felt steady. So I packed up my RV and hit the road. Paint Creek had come up in my research as a serene, lesser-known spot for nature lovers. I thought it would be the perfect place to spend a few days sketching and painting in solitude. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described, quiet, secluded, and hauntingly beautiful. The creek meandered through dense woods, its surface catching the sunlight like shards of glass. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I parked my RV near an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge looked like it belonged in a ghost story, its weathered boards sagging slightly, but I couldn't resist its charm. I set up camp and spent the first day wandering the trails and sketching the landscape. The stillness was almost too perfect, but I chalked it up to being unused to this level of isolation. That night, I sat by the creek, working on a watercolor of the bridge as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest around me grew darker, and the silence became oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. I tried to focus on my painting, but a strange unease crept over me. It was like the air had shifted, growing heavier, colder. And then I heard it, a faint humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but it didn't seem to have a source. It wasn't coming from the creek or the woods, it was just there. I froze, my brush hovering over the paper. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was a woman's voice, humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I'd startled it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it must have been the wind or some trick of acoustics, packed up my supplies, and hurried back to the RV. The next morning, I woke to find my art supplies scattered across the ground outside the RV. My brushes were snapped in half, my paint spilled and smeared across the dirt. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into them, but there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance other than the destruction itself. It didn't make sense. I spent the day trying to paint, but something felt off. The colors didn't look right. The lines felt shaky. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore more of the area. The old bridge drew me in again, its weathered planks creaking under my boots as I crossed it. The creek below was impossibly still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the gnarled trees overhead. On the far side of the bridge, I noticed something etched into one of the trees. A name and a date carved deep into the bark. Margaret, 1893. The letters were uneven, as if done in haste. But what caught my attention was the feeling that swept over me as I touched the carving, a sudden, overwhelming sadness that didn't feel like my own. That night, the humming returned. I was inside the RV, trying to sketch, when I heard it again, drifting through the stillness. It was louder this time, unmistakable. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was icy, much colder than it had been earlier, and the forest was eerily quiet. The humming led me to the bridge, where the fog had thickened, shrouding the creek in an otherworldly glow. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek, her back to me. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She was humming that same mournful tune, the sound weaving through the air like a spell. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped humming, but didn't turn around. I took a hesitant step closer, and as I did, she began to dissolve, her form breaking apart like mist until there was nothing left but the fog. I stood there, frozen, unsure if what I'd seen was real or some trick of the light and my overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to drive into town to clear my head. At a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed to know the area well. "You're camping by the bridge, aren't you?" he asked when I mentioned Paint Creek. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. They call her the Lady of Paint Creek. Story goes, she was abandoned by her husband during a harsh winter. He promised to come back for her, but he never did. She waited by that bridge until she froze to death. Now she haunts the creek, looking for people to join her." I laughed nervously, but his expression remained serious. "I'd avoid that bridge if I were you," he added, "especially at night." That evening, I couldn't stay away. Something about the Lady of Paint Creek drew me in, like a moth to a flame. I set up my easel near the bridge, determined to capture her essence in my painting. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in again, and the humming returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. The air around me grew colder, and when I looked up, there she was, standing in the middle of the bridge. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. She didn't move, but the humming turned into words, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Stay with me." I backed away, but my foot slipped on the wet grass, and I fell. When I looked up, she was gone, but the feeling of her presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was standing on the bridge, staring down at the icy water. She appeared beside me, her hand cold as she touched my arm. "He left me," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "They all leave." When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. I knew I had to do something to end this, to break her hold on me. On my final night at Paint Creek, I returned to the bridge with my sketchbook and paints. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seeped into my bones. I set up my supplies and began to paint, my hands trembling as I worked. I painted her story, the bridge, the creek, her lonely figure, waiting in the snow. As I finished, the humming surrounded me, and she appeared again. This time, closer. Her hollow eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward the painting. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "You're remembered now," I said, my voice breaking. "You're not forgotten." She stared at the painting for what felt like an eternity, then dissolved into the mist. Her presence lifted, like a weight from my chest. The forest grew quiet again, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I left Paint Creek the next morning, the painting tucked safely in the RV. It's one of my best works, but I've never been able to sell it. Something about it feels sacred, like it belongs to her. Even now, I hear her humming in my dreams. but it's softer now, almost peaceful, as if she's finally found rest. And maybe in a way, so have I. It wasn't my first job, and it sure as hell wasn't supposed to be my last, but something about that night didn't sit right from the beginning. Maybe it was the silence on the dispatch call, or the way the wind howled across the San Rafael desert, as if it knew something I didn't. I should have listened to that instinct, the one that makes your gut twist and your hands clench the steering wheel tighter than usual. But when the money's right, sometimes you take a job you wouldn't otherwise. The rig hummed beneath me as I barreled down I-70, heading west. The sky was bruised with the last light of day, purple streaks fading into a storm building on the horizon. I had a long way to go and no time to waste. They said the cargo was sensitive. He needed to be kept at exactly 20 degrees, and if I messed up, there'd be hell to pay. That wasn't what bothered me, though. What bothered me was not knowing what the hell I was hauling. When they don't tell you what's in the trailer, it's never good. My name's Roy Mallister. Bones to the few truckers who still know me on the road. 45 years old, and I've spent the last 20 behind the wheel. The road used to be a kind of escape for me, a way to outrun the things I didn't want to face. But that was before Carol passed, before I let everything else fall apart, including my relationship with my daughter Emily. Haven't talked to her in years, and I don't think about it much anymore. I'm good at avoiding things like that. But tonight, something felt different. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of me. Just red rock and dry air as far as the eye could see. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which was fine by me. The last thing I needed was distractions. That is, until the dashboard flashed red and the trailer's cooling unit flickered for the first time. I muttered a curse, pulling the rig over onto the shoulder. I cut the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out into the gathering dusk. The wind hit me hard, dust swirling around my boots as I made my way to the back of the trailer. I could hear the cooling unit working and stuttering like it was trying to fight off some kind of malfunction. Fumbling with the latch, I yanked open the back door and was greeted with a gust of frigid air. It smelled wrong in there, like cold metal and something decayed, the kind of smell that sticks in your nose and won't leave. I shined my light into the back, trying to figure out what was causing the problem. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping. No, not tapping. Scratching. It was coming from the crate, a large wooden crate strapped down in the center of the trailer, covered in heavy chains. My heart started to pound in my chest. The kind of adrenaline spike that tells you to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I inched closer, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching got louder. The crate shifted just slightly, as though something inside was alive. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away. I wasn't going to open it. Not in a million years. I slammed the trailer door shut and locked it tight, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Whatever was in that crate, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was just supposed to get it from point A to point B, no questions asked. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Some government experiment or something. None of it mattered. All I had to do was deliver the damn thing. The radio crackled to life as I accelerated, and I jumped in my seat. Static. Then, through the fuzz, I heard something faint. A voice. A woman's voice. "Roy, why didn't you come back?" My heart stuttered. The voice sounded like Carol's. I smacked the side of the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew louder. The voice faded, replaced by an eerie, distorted country song, one I hadn't heard since she passed. It was one of her favorites. "No," I muttered, turning the radio off. This was just stress getting to me. The isolation, the weird cargo, and the fact that I hadn't slept in 2 days. That's all it was. That's what I told myself as I sped down that endless stretch of highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The storm hit an hour later, and with it came the figures. I thought they were just shadows at first, shapes in the mist thrown up by the desert sandstorm. But as the wind howled and the sand lashed against the windshield, I could swear I saw them. People walking along the roadside. No, not people. Ghosts. Old men in trucker caps, women in long, flowing dresses, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark as the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying not to look. If I didn't look, they weren't real. That's how it works, right? I blinked hard, forcing my eyes back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching me, following me. The trailer lurched hard, like something had slammed into the back of it. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving the rig as I fought for control. My headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the desolate highway, but there was nothing there. Nothing but empty miles. The trailer shook again, then came the knocking, loud, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the inside of the crate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was done pretending it was nothing. I was done lying to myself. I had to stop. I had to see what was in that crate. I pulled the rig to the side of the road again, hands trembling as I jumped out of the cab. The wind whipped sand into my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't care. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and made my way to the back of the trailer. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more urgent. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. The cold hit me again, but this time it wasn't just the refrigeration. There was something wrong about it. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I raised the crowbar, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and pried it open. And then everything stopped. The wind, the knocking, even the pounding of my own heart. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of straw and old cloth, was something small. It looked like a statue, a human skull, but blackened with strange symbols carved into the bone. It seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was breathing in time with me. And then the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the skull itself. Voices swirling in my head, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. But one voice stood out, one voice I knew. Roy. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the skull began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The voices grew louder, and the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer. I slammed the crate shut and bolted the door. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care what I'd seen. I was getting the hell out of there. I threw the crowbar into the cab, jumped behind the wheel, and floored it. The trailer lurched behind me as I tore down the highway faster than I'd ever driven in my life. The storm whipped around me, and through the swirling dust, I could see them again. The figures. They were closer now, standing on either side of the road, their eyes following me. Some of them looked familiar. Faces I'd seen on the road before. Long-dead truckers, friends. Then, as if the storm itself parted, I saw her. Carol, standing in the middle of the road, her white dress flowing in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. I jerked the wheel, swerving to avoid her, but the rig skidded off the road. The trailer jackknifed as it skidded across the desert sand. I barely managed to hang on as the truck groaned to a stop, tilted sideways in a ditch. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty desert, trying to breathe. The storm passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I reached for my phone. No signal. No way out. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw her again. Carol walking slowly toward me. Her face pale and cold, her eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. "Roy," she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the stillness. "It's time to come home." I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just sat there, waiting as the darkness closed in around me. I didn't believe in ghosts, UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The Brown Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp, and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even. But as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need: high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. And anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. Focus, I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away, but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee, and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were. Three lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black. The screen dead. What the hell? I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, the camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for. The lights, right there in front of me, and I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference. Some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold, so cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger. Too large. I watched, heart pounding, as they bobbed and weaved. Their glow cast long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense, because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment, or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across. And they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest. Close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles, as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes, faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead, a welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints, dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal and the frost melted away, but I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain lights. But what I found was something else, something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more, something ancient, something dangerous, something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out. It had been 4 months since the divorce was finalized, and I was still trying to wrap my head around it. The life I had imagined, the woman I thought I would grow old with, it was all gone. That's why I decided to take the RV out to Mount Hood National Forest for a long weekend. I needed to get away from everything. No people, no reminders, just me and nature. My therapist said it would be good for me to clear my head and reconnect with something that didn't remind me of failure. Honestly, I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try something. If I stayed home, I would have just drowned myself in the silence of my empty apartment. This trip, I told myself, would be different. I could handle the quiet out here. I arrived in the late afternoon, pulling the RV into a spot near Timothy Lake. It was a beautiful area. Tall Douglas firs surrounded the lake like silent sentinels, the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. There were no other campers nearby, which was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I parked, shut off the engine, and took a deep breath. The air was cool, crisp, with that faint scent of pine needles. perfect. For a moment, I thought I could finally breathe again. After setting up a small campfire, I sat back in my foldable chair, staring at the fading light over the mountains. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Peace. That's what I needed. But as the sun dipped lower, the quiet became overwhelming. There was no wind now, no rustling, no animal sounds. Just me, sitting in a bubble of silence. I checked my watch. It was just after 6 p.m. That's when I noticed it. It was too quiet. The forest around me, which should have been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, was dead silent. At first, I figured it was just a lull, but as the minutes dragged on, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I could hear the blood pumping in my ears, the soft crunch of every movement I made in my chair. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Maybe this was what true isolation felt like. No noise, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement between the trees. It was subtle, a shadow slipping between the trunks, just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look. I froze, squinting into the woods. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that played tricks on my mind. I scanned the tree line, waiting for the shadow to return, but saw nothing. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving in the dead air. Must be a deer, I muttered, forcing myself to relax. The wind picked up briefly, rustling the leaves. I sighed, relieved to hear some kind of noise again. I grabbed a few more logs and threw them onto the fire. The crackling wood was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I told myself I was just on edge from being out here, alone, with too much time to think. After eating a quick meal, I decided to call it an early night. The silence was getting under my skin, so I climbed into the RV, locked the door behind me, and settled into the small bed in the back. My phone had no signal, of course, but I wasn't planning on talking to anyone anyway. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to let my mind go blank, but the silence didn't let me rest. The RV was soundproofed, but even then I felt like something was missing. No crickets, no owls, nothing, just the absence of sound. I felt trapped inside my own head. Every little shift of the mattress or rustle of my blanket amplified in the quiet. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. There hadn't been any loud noises or nightmares, just silence. But something was wrong. My skin prickled with unease. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and glanced around the RV. The windows were fogged up, and the air felt heavier, somehow oppressive. I heard something outside. No, that wasn't right. I heard nothing outside. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, listening closely. It was the strangest sensation, like my own breathing was distant, muffled, as though I wasn't entirely in my own body. I moved toward the window and wiped away some of the condensation with my sleeve, peering into the blackness beyond the RV. For a long time, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows, and then movement. This time, I was sure. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the moonlight. Tall, unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something. My heart leapt into my throat as I strained to see more clearly. It didn't move, just stood there watching. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. I backed away from the window, heart pounding, my mind racing. Was it another camper? Some kind of ranger? No, there was no way anyone would be out here this late without a sound. I checked the door. It was still locked. Good. But I felt exposed, vulnerable, knowing that whatever was out there was watching me. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished. As if it had never been there. The next morning, the forest was still eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, just the constant oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, but it clung to me like a wet blanket. I told myself I was just paranoid, that the solitude was messing with my head, but something about the way the air felt today, something was off. I decided to take a short hike to clear my mind, hoping that getting out of the RV would make me feel better. But as I ventured down the trail, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but the trail was empty. That's when I saw it again, a figure, this time in the distance, standing between the trees just off the trail. It was the same one from last night, tall, gaunt, and still. My heart hammered in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out more details. But before I could move, it slipped behind the trees and disappeared. I ran toward the spot where I'd seen it, my boots pounding against the damp earth. When I reached the trees, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, catching my breath, feeling the silence pressing down on me like a vice. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest around me was completely still. Even my footsteps had stopped making noise. I stopped my boot on the ground, but I heard nothing, not even the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Panic surged through me. I clapped my hands together. Nothing. No sound. My breathing was shallow, frantic, but it was like I was listening to it from far away. The world had gone completely, impossibly silent. And then I saw them. Not just one figure, but several, moving between the trees. Their bodies blended with the shadows. They were everywhere, circling me in complete silence. My heart raced, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. My legs felt heavy, every step muted, like I was running underwater. The forest shifted around me, the trail disappearing into the thick fog that had rolled in, disorienting me further. Somehow I made it back to the RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but still no sound. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was useless. The screen flickered, the GPS spinning in circles. I was trapped. For the next few hours, I stayed inside the RV, pacing back and forth, trying to calm myself down, but the silence never lifted. I couldn't even hear my own thoughts anymore. Just the crushing weight of nothingness. And then, as the light began to fade, I saw them again, the silent ones. They were standing in a circle around the RV, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. There were no features, no mouths, just smooth skin where their faces should have been. They stood perfectly still, watching me through the windows, their bodies unnervingly thin and elongated. I banged on the windows, screaming, but of course, no sound came. They didn't flinch, didn't move. They just stared, waiting. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. Every time I tried, the engine sputtered and died, as if something was draining the life out of it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside. The silent ones didn't move, didn't react. But as I walked toward them, the air grew colder, the silence even more oppressive. My footsteps made no sound. My breathing was barely there. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around, expecting to see one of them behind me. But there was nothing, just the fog swirling around me and the figures waiting in the distance. In that moment, I realized what they wanted. They weren't going to kill me. No, that would be too simple. They wanted me to join them, to become one of them. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a part of them, and it was seeping into me, stealing my voice, my thoughts, my very sense of self. And if I stayed here much longer, I knew I would lose everything. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, I was driving far away from the campsite, from the silent ones. The sound of the engine, the tires on the road, it was all faint, like I was still caught in their grip. But at least there was something, a reminder that I hadn't completely disappeared into that silence. It's been weeks since I got back, but I can still feel it. The quiet follows me, lingers in the corners of my apartment. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I know that one day, they'll come for me again. This time, I won't be able to run. My name is Jacob Johnson, and this happened back in 1996 out near the ragged coastline of Maine. I had this idea of finding some peace, so I borrowed my uncle's RV for the summer, thinking I'd get some fresh air, recharge from life. I figured I'd get in some solo time, a few fishing trips, some quiet nights. That's how I ended up at a park near Black Harbor, a little nowhere town that didn't even get cell reception back then. This wasn't a famous national park or even one of those scenic overlooks that people make pilgrimages to. It was just woods, rough and thick, fading into a rocky coastline that nobody seemed to care about. I was a few days into my quiet escape, living off canned beans on a half-empty propane stove that hissed with a little too much attitude for my taste. The most exciting part of my day was waiting for the rain to pass so I could take out my fishing rod. I didn't expect much more than sea salt air and seagulls. It was halfway through my fourth day, sometime in the late afternoon, that I heard what I figured must be kids from the local town messing around. The voices were faint, echoing through the woods in some distant way that made it hard to place them. I thought about walking down to see what was going on, maybe throwing a rock or two to scare them off if they got too close, but I didn't think much of it. By evening, though, something had shifted. I heard footsteps, not the quick, careless crunch of sneakers, but deliberate, slow steps. I was in the RV, scratching down a grocery list of things I'd need on my next trip back to town when I caught the sound. It was steady, creeping up around the corner of the RV. It hit me that I hadn't seen another soul out here since I'd arrived, and that didn't sit right. I mean, who comes out to this kind of place aside from someone with a taste for quiet or trouble? I kept still, waiting for the person to pass or show themselves, but there was only the slow, shuffling drag of footsteps. I tried to listen for the sound of multiple feet or voices, but it was dead silent except for that single shuffle. Against my better judgment, I opened the RV door and stepped outside. Nothing, just trees swaying in the evening light. But my instinct told me to keep quiet. I could still feel something out there, hiding, the kind of presence that prickles the hair on your neck and makes you regret stepping out of safety. I stayed there, scanning the tree line, listening. I almost thought I'd imagined it until I spotted something strange, half hidden between the trees, a figure, still as stone, facing away from me. The guy looked like he was part of the forest itself, cloaked in grime, with torn, mud-stained clothes hanging off him like a loose second skin. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Just stood there, as if rooted to the ground. Now, I don't scare easy, but something about this man felt like a bad omen. I cleared my throat, thinking maybe he was some lost hiker or drifter, but he didn't flinch, didn't even look at me. Finally, I called out something casual, like asking if he needed directions. Still nothing. After a long moment, he turned, slow, like he was trying to remember how to move. His face was something I'll never forget, but not because it was scary exactly. It was hollow, if that makes any sense. This blank expression, like he'd forgotten what it meant to be human. He took a step forward, just one, like he was testing the ground. I backed up so fast I almost tripped. I tried to laugh it off, told myself he was just some messed up camper, but the way he looked at me, it was like he wasn't looking at me at all, just through me. I ducked back into the RV, my heart racing, and locked the door. It felt stupid, locking up, but something about him felt off, like he wasn't just some regular guy lost in the woods. I figured he'd wander off, but minutes later, I heard him shuffling again, this time closer to the RV. I looked out the window and saw him standing right there, not more than 10 feet away. His face twisted into this deadpan stare that sent a chill down my spine. Then came the whispering. Low, muttering sounds, barely audible, like he was talking to someone only he could hear. At first, I thought he was addressing me, but then I realized he wasn't looking at the RV at all. His head tilted, and he mumbled something about payment and lost souls. The words were scattered, fragmented, like someone trying to piece together a broken sentence. I sat there watching him, my heart pounding so loud I thought he'd hear it, but he just kept muttering, almost in a trance. At that point, I was just about ready to pack it up and find somewhere else to park. I reached for my bag, ready to throw some stuff together, when the RV suddenly rocked. I heard metal groaning, and something slammed into the side with a force that shook the whole rig. I was paralyzed for a second, gripping the edge of the table as the guy outside went silent. All I could hear was his breathing, loud and ragged against the thin walls of the RV. I heard a scratching sound, nails or something, scraping along the side, followed by a soft thud, as if he was testing the edges, feeling out the RV like it was some sort of animal he was trying to corner. I kept still, my back pressed against the wall, listening to every sound. I'd never felt fear like that. This primal kind of terror that kicks in when you realize you're trapped. The scratching stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps receding. I took a breath, thinking maybe he'd finally left, but then I smelled something foul. It was a metallic, rotten scent that crept through the vents, filling the air inside with a stench so bad it turned my stomach. I gagged, covering my nose, and nearly bolted for the door. Before I could, I heard him speak again. His voice was low and guttural this time. He muttered louder, "Must be paid." I froze, not sure if he was talking to himself or if he was giving some kind of twisted warning. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I grabbed my bag and edged toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I took a quick look through the window and saw him walking away, his figure disappearing into the trees. I bolted, taking off through the woods in the opposite direction. The sound of his footsteps echoed somewhere behind me, and for a moment, I thought I could hear him muttering again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I'd cleared the tree line and hit the gravel road. My feet ached, and my lungs burned, but I didn't care. I just kept running, putting as much distance as I could between me and that place. Hours later, I found a small gas station by the highway and told the cashier everything. He gave me this look, like he'd heard it before, then mumbled something about an old man who'd gone crazy years ago, back when the town was still booming. He said the guy used to wander the woods, talking to himself about debts and payments, claiming to be some sort of collector. Local legend had it that he went mad after his family drowned in a storm. The story was that he'd gone feral, taking to the woods, driven by some twisted sense of revenge or justice. I don't know if I believe in all that. All I know is that I saw him, heard him, and every time I think of that muttering, "Debt must be paid," I feel a chill that doesn't fade. I don't know who he thought I was or what debt he imagined I owed, but I'll tell you one thing. I'm never setting foot near Black Harbor again. Some debts you just don't pay. When I left the city, I was desperate for peace. After a messy divorce and years spent staring at screens, I wanted silence. Real silence. Not the muffled hum of traffic or the constant buzz of electronics, but the quiet only nature could offer. That's how I ended up in Mohan State Park, alone in my old RV, parked on the edge of the Clear Fork Gorge. The park was stunning, especially in the late afternoon light. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their leaves a tapestry of green and gold. The air smelled clean, untouched by asphalt or fumes. It was perfect, at least at first. The first day was uneventful. I hiked the main trails, snapping a few photos with my phone, and spent the evening cooking a simple meal on my RV's small stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a rare kind of contentment. This was what I needed. No emails, no ex-wife, no one telling me what to do or who to be. Just me in the woods. But by the second day, things began to feel off. It started when I noticed the trail. I had been walking back to my RV after a long hike when I spotted it. A faint path branching off the main one, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It was narrow, barely more than a line of packed dirt, and it twisted sharply into the woods. Something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just tired of the predictability of the main trails. Whatever it was, I stepped off the beaten path and onto the faint trail. The air felt different as I walked, heavier, quieter. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After a few minutes, I found the ruins. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw the remains of a chimney and the rotting beams of what must have been a small cabin. A rusted metal lantern sat in the dirt, its handle broken. The ground was littered with shards of pottery and what looked like animal bones. A shiver crawled up my spine. Someone lived out here, I muttered to myself. The idea seemed impossible. This part of the park was miles from any road, and the trail was nearly invisible. Why would anyone build a cabin here? I snapped a photo and turned back toward the RV, eager to put the strange scene behind me. That night, the noises started. I had just crawled into bed when I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like someone stepping on a twig. I froze, my heart pounding. Raccoons, I told myself. Or maybe deer. I wasn't exactly deep in the wilderness, so wildlife was normal. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. They circled the RV, crunching the dry leaves and stopping occasionally, as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, shining the beam into the trees. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Is someone out there?" The forest stared back at me, silent and empty. After a few minutes, I retreated inside, locking the door and double-checking the windows. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I convinced myself it was just a hiker passing through. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I stopped by the visitor center to report the strange noises. Leah, the park guide on duty, greeted me with a friendly smile, but it faltered when I described what I'd heard. "You were near the old trapper's cabin, weren't you?" she asked, her voice low. I blinked. "Trapper's cabin?" she nodded. "It's an old story. Back in the early 1900s, a man built a cabin deep in the woods, far from anyone else. They say he was reclusive, didn't trust people. One day, he just vanished. No one knows what happened, but some locals think his ghost still wanders the forest." I couldn't help but laugh. "Ghosts? Come on." Leah shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I'd stay away from that area if I were you. People say the forest gets strange near the cabin." I left the visitor center feeling annoyed. Ghost stories were fine for campfire entertainment, but I wasn't about to let a local legend ruin my weekend. That night, the disturbances grew worse. I was halfway through dinner when the lights in the RV flickered and went out. I swore under my breath, grabbing a flashlight to check the breaker. As I fumbled with the panel, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time, circling the RV like a predator sizing up its prey. The flashlight beam caught something on the ground. Footprints. Human footprints. Large and deep, as if whoever made them was heavy. My breath caught in my throat. "Okay," I muttered, trying to steady myself. "Someone's messing with me." Grabbing my hiking boots, I stepped outside, determined to confront whoever was out there. But the second I stepped into the clearing, the forest fell silent. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against my ears. That's when I saw the first figure. It was pale and thin, barely more than a shadow against the trees. It stood perfectly still, its face obscured by darkness. Then it moved, not toward me, but away, disappearing into the woods without a sound. I didn't follow. Instead, I locked myself in the RV, sat by the window gripping a kitchen knife, and watched the forest until dawn. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I had to go back to the cabin. I needed answers. The trail felt even more oppressive in the daylight. The air was thick, and the silence was absolute. When I reached the clearing, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small, rusted knife lying in the dirt. Next to it was a notebook, its cover warped with age. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages. Most of the writing was illegible, but a few sentences stood out, scrawled in jagged letters. "It watches from the trees. Don't disturb the woods. The forest is alive." A chill ran down my spine. As I turned to leave, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the dirt rippling like water. The trees creaked, their branches twisting unnaturally. And then I felt it. A presence. Something unseen, massive, and ancient. Watching me from every direction. I ran. The RV was my only sanctuary, but even there I wasn't safe. The lights flickered. The floor trembled. The air grew thick with the stench of damp earth. Through the window, I saw the pale figure again, joined by others. Shadows slipping between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground beneath the RV began to groan, roots writhing like snakes. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. It roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas. As the RV lurched forward, the figures began to move, their blank faces turning toward me. The roots clawed at the tires, but the momentum was enough to break free. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Mohan State Park. Whatever was in those woods, it didn't want me there. And I was more than happy to stay away. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the forest. I hear footsteps outside my window, and I swear I can feel its eyes on me. The forest doesn't forget, and neither do I. My name is Noah Brown, and I'm 36 years old. This happened last fall when I decided to take my first solo RV trip to Spruce Knob Lake in West Virginia. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to escape the wreckage of my divorce and prove to myself that I could handle life on my own. I was tired of feeling like a failure, and this trip was my attempt at reclaiming some confidence. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. The forest doesn't care about your pride. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, thanks to winding mountain roads and a temperamental GPS that insisted I make turns onto non-existent paths. Spruce Knob Lake lay in a valley, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Before heading to the lake, I stopped at a small gas station on the edge of town to fill up and grab a few snacks. The attendant was an old woman with gray hair pinned in a tight bun. Her eyes had the kind of intensity that made you feel exposed. "Heading to Spruce Knob, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "A couple of days by the lake should be peaceful." Her expression darkened. "Don't go wandering the woods after dark, and if you see a lantern, you turn the other way." "A lantern?" I chuckled nervously, hoping to break the tension. "I'll keep that in mind." But as I drove away, her words lingered in my mind. By the time I reached the campground, the sun was dipping below the tree line. I parked the RV near the edge of the lake and set up a basic campsite. My gear was minimal: a rented stove, a secondhand flashlight, and a cheap folding chair that creaked every time I shifted my weight. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. The rustle of leaves, the soft lap of water against the shore, the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. Around 9 p.m., as I was reading by the dim glow of my lantern, I noticed something strange. A flickering light in the woods across the lake. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight or the glow of a campfire. It moved erratically, like an old oil lantern swaying in someone's hand. At first, I thought it might be another camper. But the more I watched, the more unsettling it became. The light moved deeper into the trees, then stopped, then blinked out. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I decided to explore one of the trails that looped around the lake. The air was crisp, the leaves a vibrant mix of red and gold, and for a while, I felt like I'd made the right choice coming here. About an hour into my hike, I heard it. Soft, rhythmic giggling. A child's laughter coming from somewhere ahead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. No response. As I rounded a bend, I saw her, a little girl sitting on a rock by the trail. She looked about 10 years old, with dark hair and a pale face. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a long skirt and a cardigan that seemed out of place. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on something in the distance. "Are you lost?" I tried again. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me out of the corner of her eye. Then she stood and walked into the forest without a word. "Wait," I called, hurrying after her. But when I reached the spot where she disappeared, there was no sign of her. Just a muddy child's shoe sitting on the ground. By the time I got back to the RV, the clouds had rolled in, turning the afternoon gray and heavy. I tried to push the encounter with the girl out of my mind, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe she was a local kid playing in the woods. That night, things got worse. The electrical system in the RV started acting up. The lights flickered erratically, and the radio turned on by itself, blasting static. My flashlight died, even though I had just put in fresh batteries. I lit my lantern for some semblance of control, but the flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the RV feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Then came the sound of footsteps. They circled the RV, slow and deliberate. I peered out the window but saw nothing. Still, the sound continued, crunching leaves and snapping twigs just outside. I locked the door and sat on the bed, gripping a kitchen knife I'd brought for cooking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then a voice broke the stillness. "Stephen," it said, a child's voice. Against every instinct, I opened the door. The forest beyond was shrouded in darkness, but there it was again, the flickering light. The lantern hovered at the edge of the woods, swaying gently as if beckoning me closer. And then I saw her, the little girl, standing beneath the light. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying through the still air. I stepped out of the RV. My legs moved almost against my will. The lantern retreated into the forest, and I followed. The girl's figure was always just out of reach. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, the ground soft and uneven beneath my boots. The lantern led me to the edge of a ravine, its rocky walls plunging into darkness. At the bottom, I saw something glinting, a small mirror, cracked and streaked with dirt. The little girl stood beside it, her pale face illuminated by the lantern's eerie glow. "Jump," she said softly. "What?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "You have to jump," she repeated. Her voice wasn't pleading anymore. It was cold, commanding. I looked down at the ravine, at the jagged rocks below. The lantern hovered above the abyss, flickering like it was waiting for me to obey. Something in me snapped. "No," I said, my voice firm. The girl's face twisted into something monstrous. Her eyes darkened, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You don't get to choose," she hissed, her voice no longer human. I reached into my bag and pulled out my journal, the one thing I'd brought to document my journey to rediscover myself. Without hesitation, I hurled it into the ravine. The lantern flared violently, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The girl screamed, a sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night, and then she and the lantern vanished. I stumbled back to the RV, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The electrical system was working again, the lights steady, the radio silent. I packed up and left before the sun rose, driving until I was miles away from Spruce Knob Lake. A week later, I found something waiting for me in my apartment. Sitting on the kitchen counter was an old oil lantern, its glass cracked and filled with ash. When I picked it up, I heard it, soft, rhythmic giggling, echoing from somewhere deep inside. I haven't camped since. The wilderness isn't always what it seems. Sometimes it's better to stay lost in the chaos of the city than risk finding what waits in the silence of the woods. My name is James Stevens, and this happened to me back in 2002 while camping in Mount Rainier National Park. I'd borrowed my cousin's RV for the first time. He said I was due for some real scenery therapy, as he called it, away from the stress and noise of the city. I had just wrapped up a divorce, and my mind was cluttered. Nature felt like a good reset button. I set up at Cougar Rock campground, a secluded part of the park with tall pines and a stream that burbled quietly just out of sight. Peaceful, until the silence starts creeping up on you. The kind of silence that makes every sound, like a twig snapping or water trickling, seem 10 times louder. I parked the RV near the forest's edge, half a mile from the nearest camper, figuring the solitude would be good for me. Less human interaction, more time staring at clouds and mountains. Around mid-afternoon, I met another camper. His name was Russell, an older guy with a scraggly beard and a perpetual frown. He told me he'd been camping there for years, always alone. He said he liked the solitude, the natural rhythm of the place, whatever that meant. He had this rough way of talking, every word thick like he was chewing on gravel. Friendly enough, though, and I thought it was kind of nice to have a fellow loner around. We talked a bit about the area, and then he mentioned something about strange folks drifting into the park lately, people who didn't seem to belong. as he put it. I shrugged it off, but I did notice that Russell's campsite was a mess, with empty cans and old camping gear scattered around like he'd set up for the long haul. I got this off feeling like he wasn't there just for the peace and quiet, but I brushed it off. He was just another stranger in the woods. No more, no less. By sundown, I was back at my RV, thinking a quick dinner of instant noodles would do just fine. I cranked up the little camping stove, ate in silence, then decided to go for a short walk by the water, flashlight in hand. The stream was a faint line of silver under the moonlight, but everything else had fallen into darkness. I'd taken just a few steps when I saw someone else on the trail. Not Russell. This guy was tall, with wild hair, clothes that were patched and frayed, and a scar that ran from his left cheek down to his neck. I gave him a nod, the casual, keep your distance nod people give in the wilderness. He didn't respond, just stared back, his eyes lingering a bit too long. I kept walking, but I could feel his gaze following me. It was like the guy was sizing me up. Back at my RV, I locked the door and made sure the windows were secure. I had just settled in to get some sleep when I heard footsteps. Light ones at first, like someone trying not to be heard. I thought maybe it was Russell. Maybe he'd had a bit too much of whatever he was drinking by the fire earlier. So I ignored it. But then the footsteps grew louder, then stopped, right by the side of the RV. A minute later, there was a light knock on the door. I froze, listening, my mind racing through who it could be. No one else was around. Not this late. I ignored it, hoping whoever it was would take the hint. But then came another knock, louder this time. I crept up to the small window by the door and peered out, just enough to catch a glimpse. It was the scarred man from earlier. He was standing there, his head tilted, a sick smile stretching his mouth like he'd found exactly what he was looking for. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep calm. I hadn't brought a gun, something I was seriously regretting at this point. But the guy hadn't seen me yet. Maybe he'd just leave if I stayed quiet. Then, in a voice just loud enough to cut through the walls, he said, "Hey, Brandon, I know you're in there." The blood drained from my face. How the hell did he know my name? I didn't remember mentioning it to anyone except Russell, and even then, it was in passing. My mind scrambled through every option. Stay silent? Open the door and try to talk him down? Grab something heavy and defend myself? I reached for a frying pan, the heaviest thing within arm's reach. Not exactly a weapon, but better than nothing. I crept toward the door, thinking maybe I could give him a hard enough swing to make him rethink his plans. But just as I was about to take a breath and steady myself, the guy pounded on the door. Hard. Enough force to shake the whole RV. "Brandon, open up. I'm not leaving until we talk," he said. His tone was calm, like he was asking for a cup of sugar instead of trying to break into my camper. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, like metal against metal. I looked down and saw a thin blade, maybe a pocket knife, slowly working its way through the RV door lock. A wave of panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I pushed against the door as hard as I could, holding it in place with my weight. The blade slipped, and I heard him curse under his breath. For a second, I thought maybe I'd scared him off. But then, the guy's face appeared in the window, eyeing me with a mix of annoyance and amusement. "You don't make this easy, do you?" he muttered. I must have looked terrified because he laughed, low and hollow. He tapped the window, pointing at me like I was a bug in a jar. That's when I caught the movement behind him, a dark figure moving out of the tree line, slowly, deliberately. Russell, he must have heard the noise and come over to check things out. Russell didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching. For a second, I thought he was going to help me, that he'd scare this guy off, but he didn't. He just watched, his face expressionless, as the guy kept trying to force his way in. I pounded on the window, yelling for Russell to help, to do something, but he stood there, unmoved. And then I realized, Russell was in on it. Suddenly, I was a trapped animal. The frying pan felt absurd in my hands, 2 against 1, and I was stuck inside a fiberglass cage. There was no way I'd make it if they got in. My only shot was to run. I dropped the pan, shoved open the emergency hatch in the roof, and scrambled up. The cold air bit against my face. I heard them both cursing below as I climbed, stumbling over myself in the darkness. I was barefoot, the sharp gravel digging into my feet as I ran for the tree line, my heart hammering like a drum. The RV was small, but in that moment, it felt like an ocean between me and those two maniacs. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running. Eventually, I reached the ranger station, my feet bloody, my body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. They found Russell and his friend later that night, hiding out near the campsite with a whole stash of stolen camping gear and weapons. Turns out they'd been robbing campers for months, using the park's seclusion to get away with it. In the end, Russell claimed he'd just been there by coincidence when the scarred guy attacked me. But the scarred man wasn't so lucky. After a short scuffle with the cops, he was arrested, with enough evidence of his outdoor exploits to keep him locked up for life. It turned out he had a habit of finding interesting campers to mess with, using the solitude of the park as his own twisted playground. That's what went down that night at Mount Rainier. And I still don't know what Russell's deal was, whether he was in on it from the start or just a bystander too afraid to stand up. But one thing's for sure, I'll never be borrowing an RV for scenery therapy again. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as if the forest were holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I'd heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps. One locals swore disappeared and reappeared as if it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it, film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera, set it up, and filmed a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore are fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in spiraling symbols that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving. The trees closed in tighter, and the trail became fainter, more overgrown. Soon, it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping the camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment there had been a clear path, now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me. Alone. In the fog. Okay, I muttered. You've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path, it's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look, I have a GPS," I said, pulling it out. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get this guy some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago would be choked with brambles. When I looked back, trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees, thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate," I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eli. He nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us." "The forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around like he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange, shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me. And I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life. Birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers, 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone, it was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. Hey, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. You lost? The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. I heard it too, he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Heard what? The signal, the numbers, he said, glancing toward the RV. I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal. My mouth went dry. You've heard it too? The man nodded. I'm Ben, he said, stepping closer, his voice low. I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What do you think it is? Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer. I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals. Glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. You think it's some kind of broadcast? I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. I don't think it's a broadcast at all. What do you mean? He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. We see you. My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. What the hell was that? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. We see you. I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. I think we should leave, Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal. A small glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once. An unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet.